webinar. I'm Yassi Moghadam. I'm the Executive Director of the International Society of Service Innovation Professionals. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our fourth workshops in the ISSIP NSF series on future of work, learning, and STEM skills. Today's workshop is on innovations in credentialing and industry academia collaboration. And before I turn it over to our esteemed panelists, I'm going to invite ISSIP's Vice President, soon to be President, Professor Terry Griffith, to say a few words. So Terry, I'll turn it over to you, and you can turn it over to Jim.
All right, thank you, Yassi. And if you would care to switch to the next slide. I have the great opportunity to thank the folks who are behind not only this session, but also a series of 4 sessions that have been supported by the National Science Foundation and the ISSIP membership. And I just want to take this opportunity to call out this project team. Yassi, Haluk, Lou, Martha, and Joe, you have done a fantastic job, and I'm very excited to see this, the final of this series. And distinguished speakers, you know, you have done great work here. We are all well aware of the work you've done, and we're looking forward to the material you have to share with us today. And Yassi, if you go to the next slide, I'll tell just a tiny bit about ISSIP itself. And I want to share that not only the people who are on the call today, but we have over 1,400 members. 200 universities are represented in the membership as well, over 50 companies, and we come from 42 different countries. The goals of ISSIP and the reason why you see such a diverse set of folks involved, you know, academics like myself, I'm at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, as well as our industry colleagues. We come together in this industry academic partnership to learn more about service innovation and the future of work. And with that, I'll say thank you, and I'm very much looking forward to the presentations.
Thank you, Terry. Jim, you can take it from here.
Very good. Thank you all. Thank you, Yassi and Terry. Hi, I'm Jim Sporer. I'm on the board of directors of ISSIP. I'm also a recently retired IBMer. It's my pleasure to be the moderator of this panel. And I have to say, this is one of those super fun, interesting topics because micro-credentialing is increasingly important both to academia and industry. It's important to people who are trying to get their first job in industry, increasingly important. It's important to people that have been in their career a long time, and the pace of change in their company is so fast. They have to show that they are learning, lifelong learners going into new areas. So this is an incredibly important topic and timely topic for industry and academia. And we're grateful to the National Science Foundation for sponsoring a series of ISSIP industry university interaction panels. This is the 4th and last of those panels. As I was researching each of the speakers, the only one I knew really well was David Leeser from IBM. I worked with David at IBM before retiring. But it was just incredible to get the different perspectives. So on the panel, we're going to start with Pete Janzow from Credly. And Pete is, has an amazing story to tell. A lot of the credentialing innovation, of course, is coming from startups like Credly. There's an amazing story there that we'll learn about. Sean Gallagher from Northeastern. Everyone knows of Northeastern, of course, because they have such fantastic, legendary industry interactions with their university. But Sean is also a scholar and has been doing some really, really deep thinking, not only about the present day micro-credentialing, but data infrastructure that could really accelerate things tremendously in the future. So we're looking forward to Sean's presentation. David Leeser, the man behind bringing badges to IBM. David, you've done a fantastic job. I know we're going to learn more, but I remember there a time when there were no badges at IBM, and now it seems like everybody at IBM is getting badges on all types of topics, from quantum computing to data science and artificial intelligence. It's a way to advance your career inside of IBM. And Sudarshan Krishnan Murthy from Microsoft, it was a delight to learn about your work as well. Seems like you're one of the pioneers as well. I think you all you pioneers know each other. We're getting the band back together. So we certainly look forward to Sudarshan's presentation. Steve Wright from the California Community College System is really one of the leaders getting new credentialing for digital media and ICT. And then we thought it would be interesting, Nathan Sawatsky from Cisco. He is a user of badges, so his career has tremendously benefited from this new micro-credentialing. So Nathan will tell his story briefly, and then Yassi will wrap it up with some insights from broader National Science Foundation ISSIP work. So let's get started. And Pete, I'll show your first slide and hand it over to you.
All right. Thanks very much, and hello to everybody wherever you are around the world, whatever time of day it is. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My role here is to try and explain to you a little of the history of the digital credentialing movement, how we have used this notion of skills-based verified credentials to drive forward a new model around skills-based decision-making for talent development. But it really all starts with the concept that we are all a workforce of one today. How I got involved in digital credentialing goes back to 2009 when I got laid off from a job. And I had to look in the mirror and say, what can you do? And I became a consultant overnight, like so many of us have found, whether that's through retirement or through other career transitions, or increasingly during the Great Resignation, by choice, by active choice. So anyway, what I found in my own personal journey was I needed to better articulate what I know and what I can do in a way that would be valuable to others. And that's really the initial impulse behind the open badge standard that is behind the digital credentialing movement. It was a standard created with the backing of the MacArthur Foundation and Mozilla going back to 2012. Credly was involved at the very beginning as the initial reference platform. But the real transformative moment at the very beginning was the move from saying anybody can give a credential to anyone else based on any criteria, to saying actually there is a difference in the types of credentials, the types of assertions, the types of value statements we can say, especially if it's backed by a known brand or by an accredited college or university. And so we very early on got behind this vision for representing in digital credentials what we call resume-worthy achievements. Give somebody recognition for what they know and what they can do in a way that they can use it throughout their career to get to the next step. And at the same time as we implemented that notion around resume-worthy achievements, and David Leeser was one of the early industrial backers of this idea, we also started thinking about it from the perspective of people who earn credentials. How do we help them find a job or keep a job or to improve their lives through learning? And Steve will be talking about this when he talks about the mission for the California community colleges. But the story arc progressed from there to helping organizations with a business case around the value of representing learning and development for people. In the early days, it was professional certification, it was product certification, and then ultimately around 2015, 2016, some of the leading innovators in as employers began to get behind this vision. And I think the involvement of industry and the commercial collaboration was really important to helping to scale out this idea. It would be one thing if it were educators and educational institutions alone trying to take this standard forward, but the vision of collaboration across education and from education into industry, helping learners to take forward their learning, to connect up with careers and opportunities, really helped us to establish early best practices and begin to scale the network. And that's the business we've been about since the last 5 years or so, growing across industries and professions, It started in the tech industry where this model of credentialing has been established for a while. It's scaled out into finance and healthcare. The last 18 months, there's been an incredible explosion in skilled trades, carpentry, electrical, et cetera. And a growing number of organizations that are representing soft skills in the form of these verified digital credentials. So the work has really grown more interesting in the last 2 years as we think about how do people get value, how do organizations get value out of what is represented in the digital credential. And that's all about connecting different groups, helping employers unlock the value of what they know about people, what they know and they can do, helping individuals connect up to college pathways if they never finished their college degree, or to job opportunities, et cetera. And so as we look to the future, we're really moving towards this vision for skill-based models for developing talent, for tapping talent, for helping individuals to get more out of their lives and their careers. Next slide, please. So a quick primer on how digital credentials work. Organizations build the credentials, they decide what the criteria are, and they award those credentials to individuals. Individuals then take control of those. They have their own personal profile or a backpack or a wallet for their credentials. They decide what they want to share with whom, under what circumstances, for how long. Wherever they get shared, they're always tethered back, so they're verifiable. And that means we can track data from them. And that data can inform a more personalized learning experience for people, or even talent discovery for big organizations who are looking to try and attract talent that has particular skills and abilities. So that's the basic idea behind how these digital credentials work. Next slide, please. Sorry, we didn't want to blow past the obligatory logo slide. Many of the world's leading organizations are doing this. If it's a new concept, I encourage you to learn more about it. But you know, the world's leading people organizations, SHRM and ATD, many of the world's leading tech firms. You know, you see here a variety of consumer brands, a growing number of industrial groups. Scania in Sweden is launching a program. Really excited about that. And then, of course, the usual leaders in higher education, in further education, in training, et cetera. Next slide. Okay, so we're coming in for a landing here. And what we're finding is that verified skills, as represented in these digital credentials, are helping organizations and individuals answer some of these questions, right? One of the first things that the IBM team learned was that they didn't know about all the skills and credentials that their own employees had. So this first question, which of our workers have what verified skills and credentials? Who do we put on what jobs? Who do we put on which project teams? David will speak a little more about that. It's informing groups as they begin to plan their workforce for the future, and as they begin to collaborate with higher education around modifying education to fit future workforce development needs. And then, you know, I guess the other key component is this is only going to be valuable insofar as it helps individuals drive their learning and career development, right? And, you know, increasingly we've been reminded of the importance of diverse and equitable talent agendas, and abstracting individuals and their descriptive characteristics from their skills is a great way to focus on what can this person really do without being subject to the kind of bias that can be implicit or explicit in the process. So those are some of the ways that digital credentials are beginning to solve problems in the commercial realm, and also drive forward value for the individuals who are in them. I think that wraps up the piece of the introduction that I have to give. Jim, back to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Pete. And it was great to hear that personal story at the beginning. And I think that's a lesson for every single person on this meeting, that you know, no matter who you are, no matter what your role is, at some point in your future, you may be happy that you show your micro credentials. So thank you, Pete. Next up, I'd like to just remind everybody that it's Sean Gallagher from Northeastern. And Sean, over to you.
Excellent. Great to be here. If we could move on to the next slide, I just have one content slide here. And it's funny, it looks like the layout got stretched a little bit, but that's fine. So I just want to share some points from our active research in this space and really focus on, what's the data say? What's the evidence from employers, consumers, what's happening with providers, et cetera. And it's been a difficult area to get data. Now that's changing, and that's some of what I'll highlight here. But if you go back a couple of years, there wasn't necessarily a lot of good evidence of very strong demand for digital credentials. There was a lot percolating. We could point to examples like IBM or what was happening in the Credentialing platform and so on. But especially since the pandemic, and certainly it was occurring before, you can now see, the growing enrollment and the numbers just increasing. But in terms of the outcomes, right, the job market outcomes, the educational outcomes, what do some of these credentials do for people and mean in the marketplace among employers? I just point out that's an area where we're still trying to study it and get some foundational data. So if you find that of interest, it's important work to be done. And certainly it's great to work with my colleagues here and others in the marketplace to try to do that. It does appear that there's surging consumer interest. If you look at Strata Education Network's public opinion polls that they've been doing, very large scale and continuous, certificates and alternative credentials and certifications, if you will, are at the top of the list among working adults in terms of if they were going to seek out education or training, what would they prioritize right alongside employer training, degrees, and everything else. If you look at the badge issuance numbers, which I think IMS puts out a report on each year by gathering data from Credly and other providers, that's gone up by tens of millions in just the last year or two, if I'm not mistaken. Certificate enrollment. So in some of these cases, we can now look to a set of public companies like Coursera and 2U and Udacity and others. And when you see their quarterly reports on Wall Street and the scale of those organizations, if they have millions of learners in some cases enrolled, you can see the numbers going up. And I think that's very encouraging to say that this moment, Pete traced the history back about 10 years. This moment has now arrived, and it's being accelerated by the pandemic in this online working and learning world. Pete also referenced employers and industry groups. I think that's a very important trend. We've studied that and written about it a bit. IBM was certainly the pioneer. Google gets a lot of references, but a whole host of companies, especially in technology, supply chain, finance, and other areas that are issuing their own credentials. We have a partnership, for example, at Northeastern with PwC. They're using badging to help create a more diverse workforce pipeline. And so we tried to gather some, I guess you'd call it anecdotal data, just talking with different platforms and providers back at the end of 2020, early 2021, to understand what's the growth look like among employer and industry credential issuers. And it appears that just in that 1 year, that the growth was about 70%. And that matches up with what you see happening just as one proxy with the Coursera's of the world and so on. The other thing that's happening is in the world of training and development, the corporate world, including nonprofit employers. Learning and development is shifting toward more micro-learning, just-in-time learning, digital learning, and that often includes micro-credentialing. We just put out a report on this that was based on 40 qualitative interviews with employers across a range of industries that we did this summer. And as employers move toward curated digital libraries where you open up your laptop and you have access to all kinds of courses and credentials, that's becoming a really important channel for people to maybe experiment with the badge or take an online course and then stack it into some type of a certificate or maybe a degree. Another driver is the steady adoption of HR technology. And we have a report that touches on some of that just published yesterday with One EdTech Foundation and the IMS Global Learning Consortium, which manages the badge standard. And there we did a national employer survey, and we confirmed the growing use of talent analytics by those in the HR field at employers, the growing emphasis on skills-based hiring and de-emphasizing degrees in the hiring process to some extent because it's a tight labor market, also for diversity, equity, and inclusion and other reasons. And so that world is moving toward more data and outcomes driven hiring, and digital credentials can be part of that when you look at the value proposition and how it resonates with various employers. And there is slow and steady growth in employers' awareness of digital credentials. So it's still about half of hiring leaders who don't know much about digital badges. But then at the same time, half of the market has maybe seen a badge in a resume or hired a badge holder. And that's gone up by a few percentage points each year, just like we saw with online degrees. So if you rewind to the year 2014, so not quite 10 years ago, what you'll see is that employer acceptance of online degrees in hiring was still in the 45-50% range. Now in the pandemic, and in the years prior, in fact, it's gone up to 60-70% plus. So our other research is showing us that specifically due to this experience of much more digital working and digital learning, there's growing acceptance on the employer side, which is where a lot of our focus is, of digital credentials and of online formats. But a key thing there, even though a lot of this is technology driven and people are interested in blockchain and other niche topics, is that this revolves around a lot of cultural change in what employers do and what institutions offer and what consumers are interested in and what they trust. And it's still very early. I think we're at an inflection point, and I think Pete used that term, but there's a lot to do in terms of developing the infrastructure, piloting things, demonstrating the outcomes, and so on. So hope that was useful. Really looking forward to the discussion, and we will go back to Jim.
Great. Thanks so much, Sean. And if you have a chance and you have that URL handy, you might want to put it in the chat. I did add it as a backup slide to this deck, so people that go to the website and download it can get it. But that might be great to share that recent research results. Some great statistics in there. Moving along, David Leeser, whose name has come up from several of our previous speakers, who is, when I was at IBM, David was the guy who got the giant ship of IBM to change course and adopt badges. No small task there, David. So over to you.
Thank you very much. And I called this the power of incremental credentials, but I think really it's the need for incremental digital credentials. On the next slide, just wanted a couple data points. Really, you know, it's kind of hackneyed to say the pace of change is accelerating beyond our wildest expectations. We all know that. But we also know that 50% of the labor force is going to be, the role is technically automatable within the next decade. And 40% of the jobs are in occupations that are going to shrink or be cut within the next, again, less than the next decade. And we know that also that about 85 million jobs globally are going to be displaced by the shift in technology. But there are also going to be 97 million new roles that come out of this. So the good news is that there's tremendous opportunity for human capabilities that are starting to emerge, and the need for those is starting to emerge in the market. On the next chart, just a couple more data points. I guess I used quite a few data points. I figured this is a scholarly group, right? But 50% now of the jobs at IBM no longer require a college degree. And I think, Jim, when we first started this mission with the badge program, it was about 30%. But now it's at half. They don't require a college degree. These are not entry-level jobs. These are, you know, director jobs at IBM. A lot of managers now have been coached into stripping out unnecessary requirements that are really precluding people from getting good jobs at IBM. We also know that 60% now of Americans prefer short-term training to degree programs, and that's new data from Strata. And then there's this last point here that we have 36 million Americans that hold some post-secondary education, but they never complete, they never finish. So that's the some college and no degree population. So what do you do about these, with these data points? And on the next chart, really talked about, you know, some of the things that we need to start to think about. And I think that for this group, we have to start to think about, you know, we've been talking about lifelong learning forever, and it's kind of becoming a, you know, kind of an empty phrase. But credential as you go is really the way to signal that this is actually happening. How do we start to show people and prove people's skills and abilities along the way? At IBM, we're doing a couple things along that way. One of the things we've done was we started creating some professional programs, professional certificate programs. I think, Sean, you mentioned that those are starting to grow. Micro bachelor's program that we just introduced with edX. And I think that now we're at the point now where schools are going to have a hard look at how do we start to badge in schools when somebody's ready, not after 4 years, instead of this macro credential that has less value in the market or is going to continue to have less value in the market. How do we start to create a future-ready workforce in the first semester? How do we start to give people the skills that they need and the signal of achievement so they can go out and get a job and maybe continue their education in a more non-traditional way. On the next chart, I just put some of the benefits, and these are some of the benefits that we see at IBM as well. But the first one was accelerating entry into a career. We talked about how these roles are changing constantly. The technology is changing as fast as we can think about it. Badges can provide a signal of readiness for those careers in a way that something that takes 4 years wouldn't. And matching the demand for talent. I think, Pete, I just saw one of the press releases you guys had out, or maybe it was a Forbes article, that showed that there are basically last year, I think 1.9 million bachelor's degrees were issued in the United States. And I think something like 12 million non-degree credentials were issued by just Credentialing alone. So there's a tremendous opportunity to meet this market with these types of credentials. The discrete skills, I think that there's a real need now for signaling discrete skills that are aligned to these job needs and job roles. And by the way, that also includes human capabilities as well. So we can start to future-proof people's careers. The inclusivity, big one here. Again, part of the strategy at IBM is, why are we putting in these unnecessary barriers to entry into a job? A college degree was designed originally to be a signal of exclusivity. And at a time now where we want to start to look at inclusivity, I think badges is going to be a good way for the college system to start to rethink its degrees. I'm maybe running out of time here, but the lining with the way people learn. We know that people don't learn in a linear way. We looked at the IBM model, and we looked at our data that was in Credentialing, and we found that really looks like an airline map. People don't take course 101 and 102 and 103. They take 101, then they go to a hackathon, and then they go to a webinar, and then they go maybe take 102. So I think that's important as well. The last point I want to put on this thing, and then you can read the rest about progression and everything else, but the thing about the college system, I think this is an opportunity to rethink, do we need a diploma or do we need signals of achievement? And I think that this is an opportunity for the college system to really rethink a piece of paper versus this opportunity to provide incremental credentials along the way. So I didn't go over.
Thank you so much, David. And I have to say, I remember when our senior vice presidents and GMs started requiring badges of every single person in their organization, and you'd get the weekly score charts of, 80, 60%, 70%, 80%, driving that into IBM, I'm sure was a challenge, and I'll circle back with some questions for you, David, later. Next up, we have Sudarshan from Microsoft. And I love Sudarshan, that he's passionate about new ways of skilling and helping deliver awesome learning experiences. So Sudarshan, over to you.
Thanks, Jim, and it's great to be here. I am the Director of Product Management at Microsoft, and in my role, I'm responsible for ensuring that our learners have a great experience as they're going through their learning and credentialing and certification journeys. So one of the things that I want to talk about today is from a learner perspective, from a candidate perspective, right? What are some of the expectations and what are the care-abouts? Because in today's world, it's not just about the hiring that needs credentials. It's also for employers, for customers, partners, and everyone who's in the ecosystem to actually have credentials as a proxy to determine if people have the required skills to do their jobs, right? It's not just about the entry into a job, but also how productive you are in the job. And as in the technology world, especially as the new features and services are added to products, especially in the cloud world, and things are changing at a very fast pace, you want to make sure every learner that has the credential is actually up to date and current with the skills that are required to do their jobs. So we've been talking to our customers, our employees, our partners who are responsible for delivering our solutions to our end customers. And here are some of the things that we are hearing, right? So this is just, first-hand feedback from our learners. The first thing that they're looking at is when you look at any credential, whether it's a certification or a modern digital credential, it needs to help the learners towards employability, right? It needs to help them towards a path, whether it's a micro credential or a nano degree or whatever you may call it, it has to help towards employability. And if they're already in a job, then they have to get better productive at their jobs, right? It has to help them towards the productivity at their jobs as well. So that's one of the key things that we are hearing from our learners in terms of care about. The second thing is we are continuously now moving into a world of practical knowledge, right? It's not about knowing a concept or answering a question which is multiple choice in a certification exam or in any sort of assessment. It's also demonstrating the doing skills. So many of our certifications and skilling validation methods are now going to be using things like the actual practical labs. So we have performance-based testing in order to make sure that people who understand or have the knowledge can also demonstrate that during the job. So these credentials that we create, whether it's the modern credentialing that we're talking about here or the existing certification type of credentials, they need to help demonstrate more of the doing skills than knowing skills. And as we all know, right, the whole assessment, the exam process traditionally has been a very filled with anxiety, right? So you have to know the content, and in an exam like experience, it's pretty strict, right? These are high stakes exam, so people have to go through a lot of checks. They have to do ID checks. They have to come in, and then if they're taking an online assessment at home, they have to make sure the desk is clear, nobody's entering the room. So the whole process of earning a credential is filled with anxiety today. And so we need to kind of make that more delightful, more anxiety free, right? And you have to add gamification into the mix. You have to have it, make it very engaging in terms of the content. And, people should be like, okay, I got this credential and I loved it. I love the experience. I want to go back and get one more, get another one, right? Because that experience has been so delightful. That is not there today. The process is, like I said, filled with anxiety. So as an industry, we need to work towards more delightful experiences for the learner so that they can go and earn more and more credentials. The other thing I would say is the credentials, we've also heard that the credentials need to be transferable, right? If you've already demonstrated a skill in a specific area, you don't have to go and demonstrate that skill again to earn another credential. So if somebody has, in the IT world, if somebody has a Cisco networking certification, they've already demonstrated their skills in networking. So when they get a cloud-based credential or a cloud certification, we should not be testing them again on basic networking skills, right? We should be able to transfer that over. And as an industry, as an ecosystem, we need to work together on how we make that happen. But that is something that the learners are asking, right? Please don't make me go through this assessment again when I've already demonstrated skills previously. This also leads into like the stackable model where you have to build skills on top of each other, credentials on top of each other. So if you already have a basic skill and you've demonstrated that with a credential, then use the credential to actually go into the next level, right? So make a progression in your credentialing or a career path journey. So they have to be stackable and they have to be building on top of each other. And obviously, from an employer perspective, customer perspective, or partner perspective, it also has to be verifiable, right? So that if somebody's demonstrated a skill and you can go tell what activity they did in order to demonstrate that skill, and then when did they achieve it, what was the process, all of that should be obtainable, right? So things like Credly, the badging that Pete talked about from Credly does that, where you can actually go in and look at what dates the achievement was achieved, and then what are the things that they demonstrated. Did they take a test? Did they do a lab? Did they go through a learning module? What was the actual thing that happened? So that is the kind of detail that the credentials need to have. And then finally, in terms of the bragging rights and sharing of the skills on LinkedIn or other social sites, it has to be made shareable. Every credential that we create has to be verifiable and shareable. So those are some of the things to keep in mind as we look at creating this concept of modern credentialing going forward. And this is the kind of feedback that we are getting, and I just wanted to share it with the group. And we'll look forward to more questions and Q&A in the future.
Great, thank you, Sudarshan. We'll be circling back with questions shortly, but let's move on to Steve Wright from the California Community College System. And Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Jim. I just want to mention I spent about 20 some years with GTE, which became Verizon, doing market research and product development. So when I came to the community college system, my approach was, well, how can I bring enterprise level expertise to the process of identifying skills, career pathways, and career technical education? I spent the last 10 years doing that. And I got to tell you, it's exciting. And David, earlier when you said, you know, colleges need to rethink the bachelor's degree, I chuckled because thinking is really not part of the skill set. Okay. Colleges and universities have kind of abdicated that role in the sense that they're stuck. They have faculty unions and they have an increasing reluctance to assess either students or faculty. And so the cultural or societal obligation to actually verify that anybody knows anything is by default resting upon certification providers. And it's then made very efficient by this digital construct called the badge or digital certificate. And so when I learned that kind of lots of talking with Pete Janzow and trying to figure this stuff out. And, you know, whether the examples, the Girl Scouts or whatever it is, you know, you get a feel for what this can be. So let's apply that to California community colleges, where we have 2.5 million students at 115 campuses. We have some entry level. Most people tend to think that's what community colleges are, but we have a lot of career transformers and upskillers. Average age is probably about 28 or 29. Most of them are in a hurry. Rent, diapers, and food is probably the biggest priority to any of them. We have very decentralized curriculum development. As I mentioned, it's in the hands of faculty, and they have some hoops they have to jump through, and it can take 2 years to update curriculum, but that's pretty much, it's their deal. And all the governance of the colleges is regional by those elected boards of trustees. And so, and like any institution these days, and I know this is true of all the state colleges and the universities, student completion and retention is a challenge. So that's the environment of the public educational system. Next slide, please. And in that environment, we all have an obligation. I would go to barbecues and somebody's niece or nephew would come up to me and say, hey, you're in the community college system. What can I take? You know, I need something. I got to get out on my own in 6 months. What am I going to do? And I didn't have an answer. I just didn't. And I don't think any of my peers did either. Next slide, please. So we did a study of about 400 small businesses, phone calls, 40 minutes apiece, and we determined what are the skill sets people need, to what degree, and in what order, in order to get work. And we came up with a 3-stage business information worker. And it was the skills, sometimes they were micro skills, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But all the skills that we found could map, or most of them could map to certificates. Next slide, please. And what you can see here is that we had this 3 stages, and we identify a lot of Microsoft here, but get into QuickBooks, which is one of the biggest needs out there in any small business, is knowing QuickBooks. And of course, Salesforce and those kind of things jump in there, project management. So from a business perspective, which is where more jobs are than any other category that there is in the LMI, these are the skills that people need. And it's a beautiful pathway. But could we implement it centrally? Nope. I had to sell it college by college. At some point in time, one point in time, I got 85% of the colleges buying into this program and offering some version of it, but they all have to change the name and they have to do this, that, and the other. So it was not a Big Mac or a Whopper. It was basically whatever they decided to change it into. Next slide, please. The process that we did, well, of course, the placement agencies loved it. And this is where, you know, a lot of the entry-level jobs are, as well as upper-level jobs. And so we listen to them. I know a lot of people spend a lot of money on LMI, and I tell them, don't do that. Just go talk to your placement agencies. They're placing thousands of people a month. If you want to know what you need in IT, call up Robert Half and find out what they need, because they place thousands of people a month. So they already tell you. I mean, they know, and they talk to the C-suites, so they know what's going to be on the internet in 2 or 3 months instead of this stuff that you're going to read that's 3 years old. Next slide, please. We also decided to take a look at IT, and very quickly, every pathway is a unique animal. And so what I told you about business is slightly different in IT. The most relevant criteria to get any IT job is 10 years experience. That's it. And nothing else matters as much as that. Along the way, you can get different things. A kid out of high school who's doing the Afternoon Cyber Patriot program with A+ certification is more likely to get a job than someone who's done 2 years at a community college and has a certificate. These are the most important things are specified third-party certifications, which are digital badges in today's world where CompTIA and everybody else finally decided, oh yeah, we'll join that club. And then, of course, people continue to upskill, which where you get more into the B2B talk that you guys tend to focus on. Next slide, please. So we came up with an IT pathway similar to business information worker pathway. Next slide, please. And that also correlates to, on the right, you can see the job, and in the middle, the certification and the pathways. Now, the interesting thing about this pathway for IT is it was heavily loaded with customer service and retail in the beginning. And as I showed this to IT executives throughout the country, they would look at this and say, well, that's how I got started. I was at Home Depot, this, that, and the other. And it's like, it's real. This is really, it's anthropology. It's finding out how the world really works. And it's not academic really in any other sense than that. And so a lot of our, when we showed this to employers who would hire our students, the thing they liked about it, I said, would you hire someone who's done phase 3? They said, yes, but only because they have that customer service in retail, because our employees go out to our customers and that's where they represent us. And so when we think about what we're training people in and badges and everything else, we have to actually think of a hybrid. It's not just the badges you get from one company or another company. It's this combination that makes a skill set that's valuable. Next slide, please. I'm not sure I have any more slides, but I think there's one. Yeah, so we kind of composited it all together here. And so here you see 2 pathways with a series of badges. And once again, these are not from one company. They're mixed, and they're responsive to what is real in the world. And so my point here being that the solution to this problem that I think we're all kind of hedging around is that someone has to take a leadership role and say, this is the stuff. It's not the colleges. It's not the universities. I love this group right here because this is the kind of organization and the kind of collaboration that could begin to formulate these things or come up with a structure for how it's done. So I'm very happy to be here. I think I might have taken more than 5 minutes, but I will be quiet now.
Hey, Steve, that's perfectly all right. This is great stuff. And I love your barbecue metaphor, and certainly want to circle back with a number of questions for you. There's some powerful stuff in what you presented, and really would like to dig into it a bit. So next up, we have Nathan Sawatsky from Cisco. And we thought it would be great to hear from an individual who's used micro-credentialing to actually integrated micro-credentialing into how they work and how they advance at Cisco. So Nathan, over to you.
Thank you. Go to the next slide, please. I've only got a couple of slides here. Okay, this is an illustration of many dimensions. It's many, but not all, the credentials or certifications or degrees, etc., that I've gathered through my lifetime. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is the timeline. I took a bachelor's degree back in 1987, which really seems like an awfully long time ago now. And you can see that as my career has progressed, I've gone through a variety of fairly traditional certifications. Open University, that's a distance learning, online learning. And then as we get closer to today, I've taken quite a wide range of different online courses at places like Udemy or Coursera, also fairly recently another master's degree. There's a few basic points to illustrate here. This isn't the end by any means. I mean, I don't show here, for example, that I'm also studying for an AWS certification. I shall probably go on and do more for other cloud providers. There's no end to this journey. So when people talk about lifetime learning, this is what it looks like. I did my first bachelor's degree about 30 years ago, and there's no end to a journey in learning. And that's an important point for everybody to realize. The world we're working with here, especially in a company like Cisco, relies increasingly, and as we've been hearing from the other panelists, on easy to identify, objective qualifications about specific pieces of technology you either do or don't know. Those are very important, and they do perform, certainly for Cisco, when we look at the Cisco certified range of qualifications, They are very, very important to our business model. Equally so to AWS, equally so to IBM, Microsoft, and the list will go on. That's an important part of way that people like me develop my career, because this picture you see here is not unique for somebody like me. There are many people who have variations of this kind of equitation of courses over a long period of time, and many of my colleagues have a similar experience. Go to the next slide, please. There's some basic points that I want to be able to explore in this panel. Is there a useful ontology that we can actually take out of this learning journey? Some of those are micro-credentials, some of those are traditional, but it's a fairly typical learning path. And can we take something general out of that to help others? There are different kinds of certifications. For all that technical certifications work well in some respects, academic exams teach or look for different forms of knowledge. And the difference between what we're looking for from an academic career and what we're looking for from practical courses also needs to be teased out and understood well. The industry's qualifications are really important, but they don't exist in isolation. And as I stressed a moment ago, there's no end to a journey like this. None at all. I don't expect to stop this whole certification process anytime soon, because we're chasing an ever-increasing and expanding technical landscape our customers are asking us to address for them, and therefore we have to go and learn about that and be in a position to respond. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. And great to, I really like this summary here on this last slide about the different reasons, and that's really helpful. Thanks, Nathan. Our last panelist is Yassi Moghadam, who is the Executive Director of ISSIP and the one responsible for leading the charge on these 4 ISSIP NSF online workshops that we've had. So without further ado, over to you, Yassi.
Thank you so much, Jim. Can you hear me okay? I was having some problems, network problems. I'm gonna try something.
Yes, we hear you just fine. Yeah, we hear you just great, yes.
How about now?
Still very good.
Okay.
Very good.
So that's how I'm gonna go with my phone, because I was my connection was a little bit choppy.
Oh, now all of a sudden an echo has developed. Sorry, Yassi.
Okay. How about now?
Very good.
It's good now? All right.
No
Okay.
no echo. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, and thank you all the panelists. Just this is a wonderful panel, and really I'm learning from everyone. What I wanted to share with you today is the work that we've been doing with sponsorship from NSF in the area of future of work and learning and credentialing. And the work started over 2 years ago in 2019 to gain an industry perspective on skills requirements for the future. And what we're doing today and the course of the last workshops, these 4 workshop series, is a continuation of what we started back then. And that work culminated in a paper that was published this last July by Springer, and offered, based on the research that we had done on from industry, this framework for skills development, which I'm sure it's not a surprise to many of you, that industry is looking for both specialized skills in STEM and foundational skills that span both soft skills and work practice skills. Also, industry is looking for a certain mindsets growth mindsets, probabilistic thinking, and we actually separated probabilistic thinking from the statistics and skills that you actually learn, which leads into probabilistic thinking. But you can think about that basically having a scientific mind. And then service and systems thinking about customers, thinking about who you serve, and really being able to apply these specialized skills across one's personal and professional life throughout a lifetime. And of course, in this framework, institutions need to make sure that all voices are heard and all are given the opportunity to upskill for the new and future jobs that have tremendous opportunities for learners and professionals and citizens. And the thing about this framework that came loud and clear is that professional education in STEM focuses on the part on the left that says STEM skills. But there are lots of opportunities in the foundational skills for informal and formal education. And this is what the industry wants. So there is a mismatch between what traditional four-year degrees offer, which is very specialized, and if you would, the whole person and professional that industry is looking for. And next slide, please. And with regard to micro-credentialing, the key takeaways from industry that we learned on this project was that, and we've heard it from several speakers, that STEM jobs are going through major transformation. There are going to be lots of millions of new jobs, but also millions of old jobs are going to go away. And upskilling efforts need to cover not just specialized skills, but also those broad skills, those skills that in our lingo make a professional a T-shaped professional. That is, they have problem-solving skills with depth and breadth. Given the rapid pace of technological change, specialized skills requirements change rapidly. And micro-credentialing is a great way to actually keep up with the pace of that change. And micro-credentialing can be obtained from various sources. It's from certainly universities, but community colleges, and industry and professional associations. And every individual has to chart their own learning map as they start their career and develop as a professional. And another key takeaway from industry was that perhaps traditional STEM education degree programs could less emphasize on, and this is, I know this is controversial, less emphasize on the depth of STEM skills and more emphasize on the breadth that every individual can gain and learn and take it with them throughout their lifetime that prepares them for micro-credentialing education and in fact gives them the tools to be lifelong learners. And last thing I want to share with you is that the next slide, please. ISSIP, as a professional association, is at the very beginning of using digital credentialing for our members, and we have started giving 3 different badges. We have a program that recognizes excellence in service innovation. Every year, we have multiple winners, so we issue them these badges, and also everyone who participate in one of these workshops and conferences with ISSIP, we recognize them for their knowledge eminence. So everyone, all the speakers here are going to get one of these badges. You know, this is some perspectives based on the work that we've done, and I'll turn it back over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Yasi. And next up is a break. So I invite everybody to, you know, put your audio on mute and put your camera on mute, take a little break, and we will get started again at the top of the hour, or maybe 1 minute past. So we'll all take a 3 to 4 minute break now. Thank you. Back soon, after 2022. I'm curious if you're seeing things, new innovations that are systematic in some way, technological, other types of things that you're seeing, Pete. I'm just curious, what do you see in your crystal ball? Pete, maybe you're not back. I guess I should have checked on that first. Or you're on mute. Well, Pete may just be taking a longer break. That's fine. Let me go to the next presenter and ask Sean, are you there?
Yeah. Yep. Just had to unmute.
Very, very good, Sean. Yeah, for you, actually, I wanted to go to the my backup slides to ask you the first question. And other panelists, please be ready to jump in with questions for Sean. I think this is the news item that I read, and the notable results included 73% of employers are using talent analytics in some way to improve hiring. So, Sean, I'm wondering if you're seeing certain types of, obviously we've seen the IT vendors are jumping into this, the IBMs, the Ciscos, you know, Microsoft, Salesforce. What other industries are you seeing that are jumping into micro-credentialing? Do you have any insights on that and how that might be measured in the future, how we can learn more about other industries?
Sure. So on the talent analytics, right, which is part of the picture, it sort of begins with, I think especially in the educational world, we assume that most employers are super data-driven and rigorous and have all kinds of incredible systems and processes. And while that's sometimes the case, it's often not the case. And so a lot of hiring is still based on gut, and especially as we talk about small and medium businesses, but even some of the very large ones, they don't have those processes necessarily optimized in terms of, okay, we know exactly what educational credentials and skills were required or preferred and how people perform and what it all means. And so the HR function within employers is slowly and steadily, it's actually relatively late compared to other functions, right? Finance, marketing, supply chain, pick one, to become more kind of technology infused and data driven. And so part of what's helping change that is these cloud-based systems like Workday and others, and you know, less expensive, smaller commercial tools, just like we see in all, you know, various areas of our everyday lives and businesses. As things digitize, you know, it becomes easier to see the data and to make refinements. And so that march toward more talent analytics and more rigor in hiring, including setting the process of educational credentials and experience that's preferred for a job, is steadily progressing. The 73% number that was there in the press release kind of includes the largest category of those who are doing something that's analytically oriented. but a lot of the efforts are pretty modest. Now, going more to your core question on micro-credentials, it's still early there too. Certainly, it seems to be led by the technology function, right? Not just technology employers, although the Googles and IBMs and Microsofts are prominent. But if you think about, the technology department within a hospital or in finance or just about any industry, it's always tended to be a bit more competency oriented. And certainly you can test, coding skills and you can automate different things. But it is something that's growing in interest, I think, across different industry sectors. I could go on, but I realize I'm making that a little bit of a long answer.
Oh, thanks, Sean. And I think you're a good takeaway. A couple good takeaways from what you just said are really that this HR role is turning into this highly analytic role in all organizations. I certainly see it at IBM as well. Let me ask if any of the other panelists have a question for you, Sean, and then I'll circle back to see if Pete's around. So, anyone,
I do have
any
a
of the other?
question.
Go for it, Steve.
So one of the things I'm listening to here is the extent to which the consumers of the credentialing data, essentially the hiring function in a company, how they might be able to be more efficient at what they're doing. So that's one piece of the equation, the consumption side of what credentials exist. One of the other observations I have, especially given what I know about the investments required in Cisco to drive their credentials program, is that there is scope for providing a framework for organizations who want to be able to develop credentials for their domain or perhaps for their platform, because structuring a credentials program is by now probably something that we understand quite well. We've got several examples of it. We've seen how people have done that. We could probably provide guidance. Is that something that you've thought about as well?
Yeah, so what I take from, if I understand it, what resonates for me from the second part of that question is this idea of employers and other bodies and content experts becoming credentialers, and what does it take to design a credential, right?
That's right.
What's the standard for that, if you will? What's the conceptual standard? Because as we'll probably talk about over the course of the session, there's all this crucial and ongoing work, and I know a number of the panelists are on various boards and advisory committees related to the technical standards, right? And how these credentials, sort of communicate with different systems and what the metadata is and all that. But more simply, and you could, look at the same issue when it comes to degrees, especially across nations, but even within a single college or university, is there kind of a standard frame? And do you know the outcomes that are involved, and how long is it? And, how is it structured, and how do the pieces relate to each other? I think that's the more interesting strategic question, because when it comes to the world of accreditation or even quality assurance or just the open market, there isn't necessarily agreement on what's the right packaging. And if you have a lot of experience there, as educational institutions do, or instructional design experts, you kind of know that territory. But as we have more people and entities and organizations issuing credentials, they're getting into the business of education maybe for the first time. And so how do we make sure that it's packaged right?
Right.
Thank you. And do any of the other panelists have a question for Sean?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. Basically, when you look at the industry certification providers, especially in the IT space, as they are getting into micro-credentialing, one of the things that we are always challenged with is to understand, how we differentiate between the modern credentialing like micro-credentials and our traditional programs like certifications, which are all high stakes, right? And badging as an industry in the industry is an overloaded term, right? So badging is used for multiple things. So there's this market confusion and dilution of the value of the high stakes certifications. So are there any best practices either from the academic space where there's degrees and micro-credential coexisting in that world that we can sort of borrow and and bring it to the industry. So that's something that we are like struggling with or trying to get an answer for at Microsoft.
Yeah, so there's a number of things in there. Great set of points. So I actually looked at the history of IT certification in one of the chapters in my book a couple of years back as kind of like an early instance of this, new type of credentialing that arrived back with the dot-com boom. And what did happen there, and I think you're referencing, I certainly agree it's happening today, is as you get a proliferation of certificates and certifications and whatnot, you can lose that signaling power because an employer, a hiring manager, a consumer doesn't know kind of what it means and stands for.
Yeah.
But the other piece is, and this connects to Pete's point about resume-worthy credentials, and it's kind of more complicated than this, but when there's an assessment attached and when it is high stakes or it's from a reputable provider where what was involved in earning that credential, I think presumably that has more value in the market than something that was much lighter, or that sort of can't be proven or documented in the same way. I believe the early Novell certifications, and part of why certifications in the 90s in tech became very popular, it required you to go into a lab and do an assessment and work on equipment. And it was the mark of an elite specialist, and only a small number of people held that credential. And so employers wanted more of them. But then when it ballooned to, just anybody could earn a certification, it kind of lost some of that power. So to circle back around, my impression would be the more that we can actually have assessments, and that's happening with skills-based hiring, and better documentation of the competencies and so on, then that improves the quality and the value of the credentials. But there's a lot that starts to touch on, but it's a really important question. I think the proliferation of various credentials and the confusion has only increased. I talked about the growth, especially this last year or two. You don't see things being called a nano degree, a MicroMasters in terms of new terminologies coming along. But what you do see is the term certificate is being used everywhere. And you have a spectrum where we could dig into and point out 100 different certificates that all mean different things and have different packaging, to the earlier question.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things that we also looking at is like the psychometrics that are associated with a high stakes exam, right? Should that apply to all of these forms of credential, or as you get into some of the lower stakes credentials, should we even do psychometrics, or is there another way to assess skills? And the one thing that we really want to make sure is that the person who did the work is the one that we are providing the credential to, right? So some form of ID validation needs to be there. But again, those are all the things that we are sort of debating within Microsoft.
Great. Yasi, did you have a question for Sean before we move on to Pete? Go ahead.
Yeah, for Sean. So Sean, Northeastern has been at the forefront of combining micro-credentialing with traditional formal degree. What advice do you have for other universities that would like to follow your lead, but see resistances in their own institutions?
Yeah, well, so unfortunately it's behind a paywall, but David and I actually authored an article on that for a community college audience, at least. Appreciated his help and perspectives with that a year ago. Basically, I mean, there are existing processes that you can leverage. In our case, where we basically articulated IBM's badges, and then we did the same thing with Google's certificate. We did it through a prior learning assessment process. So if you've taken a course or you have some experience and skills from the workplace or another institution, universities and colleges have processes to assess that coming in. You could do the same thing with an industry-based credential. And in fact, that's a part of, we have PMI project management accreditation for a project management degree. It exists for various business degrees, where if you have a certification or some kind of industry credential or standing, this is really big in the finance world, that kind of automatically counts for a certain series of foundational courses. So with some of it, rather than thinking of it as, oh, this is like a really super disruptive innovation, you can look to precedent and some of the existing structures that are in place. You know, one of the major trends here is the badging of experiences and coursework. You know, it's happening at universities around the country and around the world as part of the experience of gaining a traditional degree. Or if you don't gain the degree, then at least you leave with something. And so that's part of the credentialing as you go, or weaving in industry certifications for additional value into you know, an associate degree or a certificate of some sort. So badges can be a supplement to degrees rather than something that's necessarily going to replace degrees. So those are some initial thoughts.
So Sean, I'm going to weigh in here because
Go for it.
in a lot of respects, we've been at the center of this as people have used badges informally to represent learning outcomes that are assessed with various degrees of rigor. There's that kind of institutional perspective, the higher education perspective on what makes for an accredited or official learning outcome that's governed by regulatory authorities. It's governed by the Department of Education to some degree. It's governed by a wide range of groups, discipline-based accreditors. And then there's what the marketplace is doing, which is good enough for us to have a reliable signal of someone's skills and abilities for us to be able to make the decision we need to make with some predictability, some predictive value around whether a person will succeed on a job. And oftentimes there's no overlap between one or the other, right? It's like using a college degree as an indicator, a broad proxy of what someone's level of skill is or what someone's level of expertise is. You know, that's the reason that some of these big employers like IBM and all of the big consultancies and many of the other global players here are getting away from degree requirements because they haven't proven to be a predictive indicator of whether or not someone is meeting a particular skill. So it's a very fluid landscape. We've seen just in the last 24 months, some groups coming forward with different sort of external validity models that they're bringing in as an alternative to official accreditation or psychometrically valid, legally defensible kinds of arguments. I think it's fascinating and it's fun to watch the market at work here.
Great, thanks, Pete. And hey, Pete, a question for you. I like this slide very much about the Credley story of data-driven human capital decision-making, and what Sean was just saying is, you know, the HR role is becoming more of this analytic decision-making role. I'm curious, though, given your experience, what do you see out here in 2023, 2024? What are the headlines that are coming in this micro-credentialing innovation area that you think are, you know, there on the horizon?
Yeah, in the open credentialing landscape, we've often talked about the need to get to a standardized digital record of learning and outcomes in a highly structured metadata format. And what would that get you? Well, eventually it gets you machine readability of what a person's skills and abilities and knowledge might be. What can you do with machine readability? You can do all of the rest of the stuff that's going on in the broader economy now. AI applications, inferential models, various different democratizing and disruptive models for further skilling, for further jobs and employment and career development, all of those things. So it's going to be a time of incredible innovation. I'm not sure I want to get pinned down to telling you specifically what's going to happen, but once we get further down the road, and you know, at Credly, we've got 50 million of the world's most valuable credentials already in the network. So picture that multiplying out by 5-fold or by 50-fold, and then put AI or other machine capabilities on top of that. You can imagine how we'll be measuring human potential much differently 5 years from now than we have in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and hopefully able to grow human potential because we can measure it better. And yeah, that's fantastic vision. Other questions for Pete before we move on?
So I just got to talk a lot. Maybe I'll ask this one and then I'll you know, dial back some of my chatter. But I want to follow up on a comment Pete made in the chat. And it's something that we've talked about before together and connects to this employer survey we put out yesterday. Pete, if you could maybe just offer up that perspective on blockchain. The thing that surprised me when we surveyed HR leaders was about 2/3 said that it would be potentially valuable for an educational credential to be in a distributed ledger like a blockchain. But when you look, in our very carefully, intentionally designed question phrasing, you could present them with a number of things and they would say, oh, sure, that would be great. I don't see that as evidence that employers are demanding that it be in the blockchain versus any other way to verify or share the credential. And I know there's a lot of noise and excitement about that particular technology. And I know the question had come up here in the chat.
Yeah, so I mean, I think blockchain is one of the possible technical solutions for providing what people need to be able to make these predictive choices about either their own career pathway or hiring decisions, et cetera. It's the individual should have control and agency over their own credentials. The organizations that back the credentials should have the ability to update them and manage them over a life cycle, expiring, updating, recertifying, revoking. All of those need to be the requirements that are met. And there are multiple paths right now from a standards perspective to how you can accomplish that. I think, the battle is going to be won or lost by the number of organizations and the number of individuals who adopt any of these standards. And the challenge for blockchain right now is it's the multiverse, right? You've got Hyperstack, and the guy from Hyperstacks is on here. Welcome you to contribute. You've got various Bitcoin implementations. You've got Ethereum implementations. If I'm an individual, how do I decide which blockchain I need to have my credentials on? Or what service I need to have my credentials on. So transferability, standardization, all of those are going to be important. And the market's going to decide ultimately.
Can I just comment on that? I'll comment on that real quickly too. And I think we've issued, I don't know how many badges now, it's been about 4 million. We did about 1 million this year. And I think through the Credentialing platform, we can hash to the blockchain. But I think we could probably count on one hand out of those 4 million how many people have asked for us to be able to hash it to the blockchain.
Yeah, I got asked about that this morning from someone who's investigating this from Australia and New Zealand. We've had blockchain publishing capabilities in the Credentialing platform, which is probably the most widely adopted platform, for more than 3 years. And it's exactly that, David. Across all the issuing groups and all the people who've earned credentials, more than 50 million credentials in the life cycle of Credentialing. I think we've had a few hundred who've actually taken advantage of the blockchain share option. So, I'm not skeptical, but I am waiting for the market to demand it.
Thanks. Wow.
Any other questions for Pete from the panelists?
So one question, Pete, I have, this is Sudarshan again from Microsoft. I'm very passionate about reducing learner friction, right? And making sure that the experience is compelling. And what we see today is in terms of badges and the badges that we issue for certifications, there's a little bit of a friction point because learners have to create profiles and then share their badges, accept the badges and then share it. And, when somebody gets a Microsoft certification, they have to do that. And then they have to do that again for a Cisco certification or a CompTIA certification. So are there any innovations happening to reduce that friction and make the learner experience really compelling?
Yeah, so one thing we're probably not going to escape is the reality that individuals will want agency and control over their own identity. Credentialing's profile is, in the tech industry, is the de facto standard. So someone who has credentials from Cisco also has those in the same profile they would have their Microsoft credentials from, or IBM, or all of the other groups that we support. So that's one example of de facto standards emerging from a market kind of approach. But, in any kind of time of transition, there are going to be some of these friction points. In the future, who knows what it could be? It could be the universal standard wallet or whatever the service for identity and credential might be that evolves. And I think groups, providers, solution providers who remove that friction for individuals are going to be winners, right? The ones who get more utility out of the credentials themselves by connecting people up. One of the interesting models we've seen really come forward in the last 2 years, and Microsoft does this, is credential providers who had their programs evaluated by a third-party external group who provides some additional context or value. So ACE evaluates Microsoft certifications for college credit. And I can get Microsoft certified and go and take my Microsoft certifications, generate a transcript through Credly's platform, send it to the university I want to apply to, and get college credit. So I don't have to pay as much tuition. I can get my degree faster. That's really cool, right? And that's an example of the utility you can get from one particular provider right now, but who's to say what other kinds of utility might evolve in the future? Sudarshan, does that kind of address what you were talking about?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if as a group here, we have representation from the industry, from the providers, from academia. So how can we all work together to kind of make that less friction, and that way you get more adoption, right? So from the badging perspective, we issue like millions of badges, but then the acceptance is not 100%. So how do we get to that 100% mark and make that friction a little bit less, right? That's what I think we have an opportunity as a group to work together.
Can I make a comment on that too? Because I think, Jim, you might even remember when we developed the IBM badge program, and we worked very heavily with Pete on this. One of my early points of view was that we should start to set open standards and set standards across the board. And so we started sharing all of our information about our badge program. And as you might expect, made some executives at IBM very nervous that we're starting to provide industry secrets. But the idea really was, how do we start to reduce that friction? How do we start to create these standards? How do we make it easy to be interoperable, interchangeable, equivalent, and all these other things? And so that, I think that influenced some companies like SAP and others to adopt the IBM standard, to the point where there was a government group in Lithuania who said they even matched the colors of our badges for their company. But even within the IBM company, internally and externally, we have friction, because internally they want to do things in a certain way. Externally, we have different priorities and different needs. And so I think back to what Pete's saying, I think there's a great opportunity for services companies to come in and do that work, to be able to glue this together, rather than try to straitjacket badges into some certain paradigm that only fits a certain group of people. But if there's a way to take that data, because it's all about data, and be able to provide a service around that, I think that's better than trying to restrict people from doing what they want to do.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I do remember that, David. Oh, sorry, Sudarshan. Go ahead.
Great point. Yeah, I agree. I think so. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, and I think, John Ricketts is on. He's a retired IBM distinguished engineer, has written a lot of great service books about service businesses. And you were just mentioning, David, about open is best. And John was asking, do we foresee any backlash where, HR, says you earned the badge while you were here, but you can't show it after you leave. Openness solves that problem, and I don't foresee that, John. But let's ask David. David, do you think it's unlikely that HR would say only certain badges can be seen inside while you're an employer? That just doesn't seem right to me. What do you think? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute, David.
Sorry, I think like Pete was saying, with Great Resignation, with people calling the shots right now, I don't think there's an appetite for that now. If anything, there's an appetite for the opposite, is to provide incentives for people. But I mean, reality is there are colleges, or there are companies that put people through college, but they don't tell the person at the end of, if they quit, they're going to strip their college degree. How do you do that? How would you strip somebody's credential away from them? I think that's, I don't think that'd be a very good strategy.
Backfire pretty badly.
Jim, if I can interject, we work with many of the world's leading big professional consultancies, the PwCs and the EYs and the McKinseys of the world. They have legitimate reasons why some of the things they're training and credentialing should be private, and they have private credentials. Oftentimes, because these are companies that compete on knowledge workers, they compete for people and their own expertise. They don't want their competitors to know what it is that they're training and credentialing for. So they want to keep that private. But the emerging model is, after you leave, or after this becomes more of a public knowledge that the firm is working in this area, then we'll allow you to make those credentials public. And we want you to keep them, because that's a way that we promote our organization as a great place to learn and work.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful, sensitive issue. I can remember just the pressure that we would get back when I was in Verizon. If anyone knew you were preparing a resume, it's like, uh-oh, disloyal, he's leaving. And now you are no longer considered for promotion. So the whole idea now of being on LinkedIn and letting people know what you just earned is kind of like, do you realize you could be sabotaging your career? So it's a lot of, it's just kind of a feeling you get. Maybe you shouldn't.
See, that's a really good point
So,
about the LinkedIn thing, because we early on, there are people that said, don't allow, IBMers to be, put on LinkedIn with their badges because they're going to get poached. It's like, if you think giving somebody a badge is a reason that they're going to, leave the company, we got bigger problems than that. But what we found was that badges build trust. And so it improves the opportunities for our consultants. It shows the vitality of the IBM brand. And it really, again, we found also that LinkedIn told us that people that had badges on their digital profiles got 6 times more views. So the idea is that this really is a way for a company to expand its brand, build trust, and really build sales.
I think that's the enlightened point of view, and I'm glad to see it happen. It reminds me of interviewing a fellow who ran a huge entertainment center here in Los Angeles, and he used to have a rule that none of the employees were allowed to have their cell phones at work. And then he realized they were taking pictures and sharing what's happening at the venue on all these different social media sites, and more customers were coming in. So then he said, bring your phones, take pictures. So yeah, it does. There's 2 sides to this.
Unintended benefits, right?
very good, very good. So, David, I got a question for you. Let's shift over to David, if that's all right. And please do, everybody, keep firing away questions and comments in the chat. We'll get to them all, I hope, before the end. But David, I remember when I was an IBM employee, I had one beef with HR. And I haven't prepared you for this. I think maybe we did discuss it at one meeting at all, but in way back when. But, at IBM, when we put out a job posting, we probably get, I don't know, somewhere between 300 to 500 applicants for every job we put out, and that's pretty typical. And, we only hire one or, sometimes 2 if it's a broader job description. So there's hundreds of people. And because I ran global university programs, I used to get email messages from hundreds of students around the world saying, hey, Jim, I applied for that job on IBM and I haven't heard anything, or, I didn't get the job. And I think the question for you is, can we do a better job from the applicant's perspective? And I know there was some innovative work that you were talking about at one time for this, but what can we do to make sure to raise the bar for employers that when somebody applies for a job and doesn't get it, that employer has an opportunity to maintain a relationship with that person, to help them, to give them feedback on their credentials? What insights can you share with us? What do you think needs to happen in that space?
Well, I think it goes back to what we started to do with Pete with Talent Match. And I think that's what you're talking about, Jim, in a way, right? Is
Yep,
that
exactly.
Talent Match was a way to start to match employers using the IBM database of people that had earned badges with opportunities. And I think that that's something, I don't think companies are that sophisticated at this point, but I think that what you're mentioning is a really good point. And I'll tell you why. Because like you said, IBM might have thousands of jobs opened and we might get hundreds of applicants for each job. But the reality is our clients need the talent as well. So how do we start to help create a talent marketplace for our clients as well? Because if we can get people trained up on the IBM programs and then get them out there, I think that's a better way to do it. And I think we're starting to do that in a different way with these other types of programs we're doing with apprenticeships and internships and the pre-apprenticeships and things like that, where we're saying we're creating it, because the reality is, when you were here, there were hundreds of people coming in for each job, but right now everybody's fighting for talent. Yep. So, IBM and companies like IBM are saying we have to start creating these talent pools. And I think that one of the ways to do that is through collaboration with community colleges, with groups like Steve Wright's group, developing these pre-apprenticeships, and then developing the talent pool. But then the next, the final mile then is connecting them through some programs. And maybe Pete could talk a little bit about some of the ways that they're starting to think in 2022 about creating that talent marketplace.
Yeah, so, the note on the evolution slide here is unlocking opportunity at scale for individuals. and from the employer side, driving skill-based talent management. But we've just recently at Credentialing invested significantly in talent solutions, which is a simple, or maybe not a simple way to say helping individuals get their credential-based verified skills data in front of employers, whether that's an employer for a new job or an employer for their current job. So for instance, at IBM, they've encouraged employees to link their Credentialing profile back to their IBM employee profile so they can qualify for promotions inside IBM through the credentials they've earned across their career, not just IBM issued credentials, but Project Management Institute or Microsoft or AWS or Cisco, industry credentials. So we're seeing it from big employers consuming this data. We're also seeing it from recruiting and staffing firms. We use the same technology actually to give individuals the permissioning so they can say, connect my Credentialing profile with my ZipRecruiter profile. If I'm looking for a job, my first job, looking for to further my career, I can sync all the developments in my Credentialing profile with my ZipRecruiter profile. So every time I earn a new recognition, now that becomes evident to the employers who are searching for me on ZipRecruiter. So those are two examples of how the Talent Solutions unit at Credentialing is beginning to think about this. And I think you'll see a lot more, coming not only from Credentialing, there's some really creative stuff going on using AI in the HR talent acquisitions landscape.
Great, thanks. Let's see if there's any more questions for David here. Any more questions for David? And I'm going to ask Sudarshan. Sudarshan, could you share some insights on how does Microsoft deal with that issue of many applicants for open positions and trying to either maintain a relationship with people who are applying for a job or help them, understand why they didn't get the job, why there were people more qualified that Microsoft selected. Is there any activity at Microsoft that you could share with us about that, or is that not something that's on your radar?
Not directly on my radar, but I will say that there's a lot of focus right now on technical skilling all up at Microsoft, right? And whether it be employees, partners, customers, everybody is getting skilled up, making sure that there's a lot of certifications, training, everything available for our employees, customers, and partners. And in that realm, basically, we are requiring many of the roles, technical roles that are customer facing, to have certain certifications. So if they don't meet the requirements and they don't have a certification, then they have to find another job that does not require a certification. So it's almost sort of mandated as part of our technical skilling initiative. So I think that is something that we are driving, not just for the hiring, but also for people who are in roles to give them specific certifications and learning. Once they earn a certification, the certification is not valid forever, right? It has a finite shelf life of a year. And then before their certification expires, they have to go and do some continuous learning. There's free learning and free assessments that are available on the Microsoft Learn page where they can go do it very quickly. It takes about 45 minutes to do it. But we want to make sure not only people are, skills are validated when they earn the certification, but as the technology evolves and the more features and services are added, learners are also keeping up with those changes. So they have to do it on an ongoing basis. So that is part of the entire Microsoft employee skilling ecosystem, and it's one of those things that that's front and center for the company all up, right? So it's that's what I would say. I mean, it's not so much about hiring for internal jobs, but it's more like if you're in a job, how do you ensure all these people that are technical salespeople, they have the right skills to have customer conversations or to deploy Microsoft solutions to our end customers? So that's the direction that we are moving in.
Okay, thanks. Any other panelists have questions for Sudarshan?
Yes, and it's perhaps a question for everybody in a sense. One of the things that we mentioned earlier in the conversation during our introductions is the idea of being able to stack credentials. So one of the examples was given that if you'd already become Cisco certified and then we're looking at cloud certifications, which obviously include a significant portion of networking, that somehow that Cisco certification could be stacked up to count towards your cloud certification, which makes perfect sense because there's a lot of overlap of knowledge, I know. But to what extent have you, Sudarshan, been able to put that kind of idea into practice? I mean, could you certify somebody as an Azure cloud practitioner by taking into account part of what they've done in their Cisco certification, or would you re-examine them on that body of knowledge?
The way we are thinking about it, Nathan, that's an excellent question. The way we're thinking about it is, if you think about any credential, whether it's a certification or a micro-credential, there's a set of skills that are part of the objective domain that you test, right, for an individual to get that certification. Now, within that objective domain could be multiple sets of subsets of skills that are being tested. And if somebody already has a networking background and has taken a networking certification, you can actually test those individuals at a higher level of abstraction. You don't have to go into all the level of detail. Maybe you have one or two concepts that you cover as part of the assessment to make sure they have the overarching knowledge about networking. And that way, you know, their effort in order to earn that credential or certification is not multiple, you know, 8 or 10 hours. You're reducing the time that they need to prepare and take the certification. So it's just getting to that higher level of abstraction and testing them on a couple of components on the concepts or certifications that they've already have in their profile, and then making sure, you know, we can build sort of a bridge exam or a bridge path for those individuals. And again, these are all in the exploration phases. We are right now doing some pilots to see if that's even possible. Now, again, the question then becomes like, if somebody says I'm Cisco certified, how do you ensure, right? You have to have the verifications in place, and you don't want that to be a manual verification every time. So that's why there's a need for systems to talk to each other, right? If I can, you know, sort of pull the Cisco system and say, hey, this person's saying he has a CCNA. Can you validate that for me? Can you tell me all the skills, networking skills this person has earned, so that I can make him or her eligible for the bridge exam and not have him go through the entire certification process, which could be cumbersome. So I think as an industry, we need the systems talking to each other, sharing of information. That's the way we can sort of make it really compelling for learners and you know, have them not repeat, and you know, we can stack up the credentials together.
So let's take that sort of step forward, as it were. But by example, earlier in my career, I took a master's degree at Open University. That was networks and distributed systems. Since I took that degree, that program was reformed around Cisco certifications. So they basically took Cisco certifications off the shelf, and the heart of that new degree program was based on those industry certifications. Now that's a way of reusing. That's an example of stacking, if you see what I mean. They're building a academic degree program, but they're using industry certifications because they know that within the industry certifications, a lot of the basic knowledge you need to use will be examined for. Let's imagine that we could take this idea a step forward, and let's imagine that somebody wanted to earn, let's say, a master's degree in cloud networking, or a master's degree in multi-cloud, or something like that. And let's imagine we could stack up some certifications from AWS, and certifications from Microsoft, some certifications from Cisco, and somehow put all of these together in the sense that you're building a set of credits, and that there's a body could accumulate, verify that set of credits, and in effect issue what would be the equivalent of some form of master's degree level of knowledge. That's something that Pete might be thinking about at Credly, but he wouldn't be able to do that alone unless people like you and obviously my organization, Cisco, and colleagues at AWS were able to bring these ideas together. So I know we've talked about bits and pieces of that here, but how far do we think we've taken that collectively?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would be personally interested in pursuing this further with a group, because that's the kind of experience that we would want to deliver, right? Where, you know, an academic certification, a micro-credential, assuming all of these are at the right standards, because we want to make sure that, you know, the frameworks that we've used to create a certification, we followed the due diligence in terms of the job task analysis, the psychometrics, all of those things that come with it. Assuming that's true, then I think it's definitely possible to kind of stack up these together and issue somebody a master's degree. I don't know whether academia is doing that today, because academia also has courses on Coursera or edX. A lot of universities have that. So I know that some universities give college credits towards completing some of those MOOC courses, but I don't know whether you can get a complete degree right without attending a single class. But if you brought a bunch of things together that you got through MOOCs, can you get a master's degree or a bachelor's degree? Probably not. So you will still probably need some sort of an Uber case study or project or something that for individuals to really demonstrate the skill before they can be awarded a credential. But I think we can definitely look at a model where somebody has done a bunch of things. We can stack them up together and then maybe have an overlay of a project or a case study or a presentation, paper presentation, whatever is the method, to kind of then determine, is this person really completed everything that he or she's saying, right?
So,
hey, so we've got about, go ahead, Sean. Go ahead.
I'm just going to quickly add that there's some cases where that scenario is already happening today. For example, you could do the Google IT certificate and then get community college credit for it, and then or go directly the University of London Masters in Computer Science program. And the common thread here is, in this one example, is those happen to all be on Coursera. We'll accept that as credit into the program. But in the other cases, I think the common union of exchange is the academic credit hour. Now, there's probably a challenge and a barrier associated with that, right? But whether it is from industry experience, a certification, another college or university, or something else, when you have it recognized in academic credit hours somewhere, then you can get the institution awarding the master's degree to say, I get it. These are credit hours. I will accept those. And while there's only a handful of examples, I think that's the world we're moving toward, and that a lot of the ecosystem want to see is, over the next 10 years, it will be more and more possible that you can get these small units of learning from different places. And then ultimately there will be some kind of a arbiter who will, package it all together, and it can result in a degree or a job or whatever else.
Yeah, so ACE's Learning Evaluation Services Unit does this at scale for corporate training that's applied for college credit. The Google IT Support Certificate uses that as their mechanism for sort of universal credit recommendation. But the catch with ACE is they're just credit recommendations. It's not a credit commitment on behalf of the university. So there's a broader question here around university accreditation, prior learning assessment, and what universities are willing to give credit for. And it's, fundamentally universities are a 500 to 600-year-old institutional model, and they're governed by faculty, and they have their own self-interest in making people start over and not giving them advanced standing. So those are some of the conservative factors at play. And at the same time, externally, we're seeing lots of examples of industry credentials where, let's say you want to be a cloud certified engineer. There are groups now that are looking at it and saying, bring your Azure certification to us and we'll help you get advanced standing for that. Bring your AWS certification to us and we'll also give you credit. Bring your Google certification to us and we'll also give you credit. So, or something like project management and Scrum, where the project management certifying bodies are giving credit for each other's credentials. So there's kind of the way that the commercial realm lives, and there's the way that the academic realm lives, and never the twain shall cross it too often.
Hey, let's, so we've got about 5 minutes left before we're going to take our next 5-minute break. And then when we come back for the last hour, we'll open it up. We've got some other experts who are participants on the line who I know are dying to get a comment or two in. So we're going to open it up in that hour. But in the next 5 minutes, I want to really try to work in a couple quick questions. So Steve, let me go to your barbecue picture. There we go. And ask you a question. I think, Steve, of all our panelists, you strike me as the one who's the biggest advocate for the person trying to get a job. and you said something like rent, diapers, and food at one point. You talk about this barbecue question. There's so many choices, but hey, I need the money. I'm wondering if you could maybe give us some of your thoughts quickly, because I've got some follow-up questions on, is there, these are probably the, I know for returning veterans, this is like a big way. People love to hire the returning veterans if they have these skills, these IT skills. But what advice do you have for somebody who's kind of struggling? Maybe they're not a vet. They got very little money. They need money. They want to get credentials. How do you advise them? Do we need more career counselors for these people? What is it that we can do to help those people?
Well, I think you have to think, what's their objective? Their objective is to get a job. So you're really looking at throughput. So much of education is done in kind of a field of dreams scenario, and that really doesn't get anybody a job. So you have to look right to where they are. I've used this exact list that you're looking at on the screen right now with a friend of mine who was 55 and got laid off by a major international sales organization, and developed a kind of a speech problem, and he couldn't get employed. He had 2 kids in college, and he did not have a degree. And so we just looked down this list, and he said, well, Salesforce, I've been using Salesforce for the last 8 years. I said, well, can you get a certificate in it? And so he went on to Trailhead, went ahead, got a certificate, and he got a job. So in that particular case, he had to know where he was on the continuum of desired skills, and that there was an option and he could do it. He didn't go to a community college or anything. So I think in this particular case, the template is good for no matter what platform you want to use. But what makes a difference is that it will get you a job. And that's where I think we come to an answer to that kind of situation.
Yeah, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with Scott Solzberg's work on the individual learning plans, which are being adopted by a lot of the states. But schools, high schools, and other places that are shifting, increasing the number of people who are career coaches and helping people, just like you helped your friend Steve with that very, for you, simple connecting the dots. There's really seems to be we've created the infrastructure, but navigating it is still very hard for a lot of people. And a good career coach that knows their way through can add a lot of value.
Well, I would like to tag on. There's an incredible amount of BS out there about what people should do. I mean, it is just 99% of what you read is wrong. And it's self-serving, I want to hear myself talk kind of stuff that people put out, or they get a grant and they're going to put out a thing. I've seen so many misleading articles on digital media and IT. It makes me scream. But you come back to what will they actually hire? That's where I say you go to your placement agencies. You look at the industry certifications, the things that really count to prove that you can do something, and you're going to find something that's workable.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And Nathan, a quick question for you before we go to our break. And I think I may even, if you're a short answer, then we'll have one question for Yasi. So Nathan, as you look at, how your career has progressed at Cisco using these micro-credentials and others, you had a very nice last slide. Let me go to it here. Yeah. So how do you see, in terms of your career, these 3 areas right here, going back for academic rigorous work? I know a lot of big companies allow their employees to get real degrees and portions of credit from university. These practical courses like Coursera are big, and then these industry qualifications. For you in particular, I'm just curious, how do you see these 3 in relation to each other, and which ones that you think are most accessible for employees like yourself who are technical?
Okay. The first thing to realize is that Cisco actually pays for any of the training you want, and that includes the academic courses or the practical courses. All of this is valuable in its own way. And Cisco, like other organizations of its nature, is more than happy to invest. The academic courses go back to a point actually that Yasi made earlier about breadth. being able to understand the breadth of a domain, being able to reason across different aspects of a domain is very important. That provides a very, very important foundation onto which, in effect, you can plug specific technical skills. So the courses I'm taking at the moment around AWS, as it happens, are good examples where actually there's two dimensions to that kind of course. There's understanding the basic computer science and systems engineering aspect of it, which I have from previous qualifications. And then there's the specific pieces of what do they call that in AWS? What name does AWS give to that piece? But it's a very common piece in other domains. The breadth is a really important foundation. So academic courses, at least the ones I've taken, are focused on the ability to understand the breadth of a domain. What are the common elements that work across any specific technology area? And they lay a really important foundation. The other key thing is the difference between how they're examined. Academic courses are typically examined through essays, written work, coursework that's assessed objectively by a tutor, etc. The practical courses on Coursera, Udemy, and likewise, they are assessed in a way, but not to any great depth, not necessarily very objectively, but nor are they given away. So there is a level of assessment there, but it's clearly not the same depth as when you're paying for a tutor to actually mark your coursework, as it were. The industry qualifications have a good mix of depth and breadth because they are asking very difficult technical questions, which you do need to have a reasonable degree of understanding. However, to make them scale, because industry qualifications have to be reasonably cheap, the way in which they're examined can vary. A lot of them are simply multiple choice questions. There's an extent to which you can learn the exam rather than the underlying thing that the exam is going for. But it's horses for courses. You get what you pay for. Some of these routes are much more expensive than others, and they all have a role to play in filling out a career.
Thanks, Nathan. Let's go ahead and take a break now. We'll reconvene at the top of the hour. I'll circle back to Yassi at the top of the hour and go ahead and mute your video, audio, and we'll circle back at the top of the hour. Thanks, everyone. Get up, stretch, take a break.
And is really finding shared values and not really digging deep in finding shared values, because I think they can be found. And because, we see it all the time. I mean, we are a professional association that brings industry and academia together. And what I see, it's a lot more straightforward when it comes to research to come to shared values and goals. But when it comes to learning, it's a bit more challenging because the incentives between industry and academia diverge a lot of times. Having said that, I often wonder, because there are lots of innovative practices between industry and academia around new ways of learning. So, and that's what I mean, digging deep into finding those common values. And, I'm biased. I always look for finding shared values because, service science has biased me.
Right, transdisciplinary as it is, yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's a great opportunity. And I hear a lot of criticism from both sides, but I think if we put the criticisms aside and really look for points of commonality and build on those. And I think Sudarshan was saying that really come together as a group. I think there are lots of great things that industry and academia can do together in this area.
Yeah, and I think professional associations go all the way from student to first job to career to retirement. So professional associations span that whole span of the individual, which I think is another role that professional associations can play in this mix of university industry collaboration around micro-credentials. Let's see, I'm going to just start calling on some people who I see are on the call. ILIF, I don't know if you want to say anything, but I know you were asking the panelists if any of the panelists see any differences between Europe and the US and Asia. So ILIF, do you want to come off mute and say that, or we can just ask the panelists? I just did.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. I just put a couple of notes in chat on this, and I certainly have seen that in Norway, particularly some of the younger, newer universities in Norway seem to be creating more innovative and different kinds of programs together with industry. This has not been common, I don't think, in Norway. There's been a lot of collaboration on research where universities are working with companies on research. But in terms of building, facilitating the journey from academia into industry and preparing students for new jobs and so on, that has been lagging in my view. And I'm not sure if the same is happening in the other Nordic countries. You and I, you know, Jim, we know that the EU is pushing reskilling, upskilling quite a bit, and have been doing a lot of work in that area. So I would assume that they are doing more on this, and I hope to see more.
Yeah. So let's ask Sudarshan, because Microsoft certainly has a global perspective, and David, IBM has a global perspective. Are you seeing any differences, regional differences, in terms of micro-credentialing? Sudarshan or David?
Go ahead, David, if you want to go first.
No, actually. Although I will say, you know, you talk about these soft skills. There's a very interesting program going on with one of our clients. I can't mention the name, but I can tell you that the largest telecommunications company in Australia, where they are really focusing on these human-centered skills. And they're focused on that for a lot of different reasons. One of them is they want to create a future-proof workforce, but they are now trying to reorganize in a very big way their company. And so what they're finding is that they need to take full inventory of what those skills are. And because these really, when you think about these soft skills, and by the way, if you don't mind, can I share a chart real quick?
Yes, please do. Okay, I'll stop sharing. And Joe, you might have to give David permission if he doesn't.
I already have it, I think. This is a chart that I created for the United Nations. That, you know, this is kind of counterintuitive to a lot of people, because I think a lot of people think, and that we've been talking about this a lot, about, you know, these hard skills. Whether they be, you know, accounting or using Excel or anything else. But when it truly comes down to on-the-job performance, the best predictor is personality trait assessments by far. And this is only one study. There are a lot of studies that show that if a person has the right human capabilities, they have the desire and the interest for this. This really is the foundational level understanding you need to have about a human being before you start to layer on top of it some of these other things, like skills and abilities tests. And I think about that when we created one of our certificate programs at IBM around customer support. You know, when we talked to the customer support organization, they hire about 80,000 people a year. And they said, you know what, if we can find people with the right personality traits for this job, we can gladly and easily teach them those skills. We can teach them Salesforce. We can teach them, you know, ServiceNow. We can teach them whatever. But if they don't have the personality traits, they're not going to perform. And one of the, just so you know, so we created assessments around that. And we ran them through a program called My Inner Genius to see if people would fit it. And one of the traits that we tested for was hostage negotiation, which was very interesting because people that are on the sport lines, it's kind of like they have to talk somebody off the ledge, right? But I think, but back to that point there's a lot of work going on in some of these companies that we're working with in other parts of the world that are now starting to rethink how important is it that people have some of these other areas like these skills and the job experience and everything else versus Do they have the future-proof human capabilities? And I know that when I first started this program at IBM, it was kind of dismissed. Like, oh my goodness, what, you're going to test a person on creativity? You're going to create, on resilience? What are you talking about? Turns out that they were wrong. These are more important for on-the-job performance. So I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, I'll just say the positive management course that I took at IBM was fantastic, David, and it does teach you a lot of things about how much pressure you don't even realize your body's building up pressure in certain meetings until you start being more aware of these things, and they're really helpful. I see Steve may have something to say. Sean, Pete, go ahead.
I'd be happy to chime in on that one. I think you're spot on. I mean, digital badges are great, but there's a tendency to build a cathedral out of all these digital badges when really we just need a few little ones here and there to help people move from one place to another. But the motivation and then the personality traits you just talked about are critical. And we see it in students all the time. They may come in with a background in one area, but they're really motivated to learn something else. When it comes to hybridization, who doesn't remember Steve Jobs' graduation speech where he talked about going into the calligraphy class and that wasn't a badge, so I mean, we all are motivated and we're intrigued by many different things, and to take out the human element of intrigue and motivation, you're really missing a lot. So hopefully we can keep that part alive in these discussions. I'm not sure if you can digital badge that or not, but I'd be scared if you could.
And I just wanted to respond to the international point in part of the original question. So a couple days ago, the European Union, the European Commission delivered a proposal for a European approach to micro-credentials for lifelong learning and employability. That was in the works for maybe about a year, was involved in that a tiny bit. But the fact that that exists, and then you consider, well, what do we have in the US? Australia has a micro-credential framework, the province of Ontario and Canada. So depending on your jurisdiction and how the higher ed system or other aspects of the job training and learning system are governed, there are cases where there are attempts that are very early to kind of roll out a standard, a set of policies, maybe incentives to do this. And I think we've even seen that at the state level in the US, where different systems have said, hey, we want our colleges to engage in more of these practices. But it is very interesting, for me at least, to kind of look overseas and consider what are other nations doing. And then, regardless of your politics, is there some role for some thoughtful policy in a government or, some other kind of infrastructure or guidance to kind of pull things together versus the mass market open approach that we have here right now?
Jim, if I can just chime in here. From a strategy perspective, we are not seeing any differences in terms of requirements from specific countries or regions of the world. Ours is a global program, so we want to make sure from an execution standpoint, whatever form of credentialing, assessments, things that we do is scalable across the world, right? It has to be inclusive. It has to pretty much reach every learner in every corner of the world, right? That's kind of the principle of our program. And so with that in mind, when we build experiences related to credentialing, whether it's performance-based testing or a game-based assessment, whatever we do, we want to make sure that's inclusive by design, and then we have the ability to deliver it at whatever location we need to do it, right? So that's kind of one of the considerations as we build out the framework. So from a strategy perspective, not too many differences, but from operational execution standpoint, there's a lot of consideration that goes into play as we sort of evolve our program.
Yeah, and I also see actually distinct difference between the approach here and in Europe, and that is really the ownership of stakeholders that are involved. I think in the US, the individual learner feels more empowered in charting their own learning path. in Europe, they look more to the state and other institutional authorities to do that. And I find the various stakeholders, whether it's government, whether it is companies or institutions, educational institutions, to be more invested in working together around upskilling opportunities.
Great, great. Hey, I want to give some people who may have different perspectives opportunities here as well to interact with our panelists. And I don't see them on right now, but I did get several emails from people in Africa. So sorry if I don't recognize your name, but if we do have anybody on from Africa, I wanted to make sure to create a little bit of space for you in particular, because several people from Africa sent me some very intriguing questions about micro-credentials for our panelists. So let me just pause for a minute.
I also want to bring it to your attention. There is a question from Alexandra Medina Borja.
Okay.
And
go for it, Yassi. Bring that question in while if anyone from Africa can ping in the chat. Thanks. Go ahead, Yassi.
For all panelists, this is a question for all panelists. What are the pressing research questions about credentialing and higher education from where you stand?
Pete, what do you think? Research questions you'd like to see NSF or others fund to get answers to?
Yeah, I think these issues around accreditation and quality need to be researched and level set. I think there's a lot of work to be done. I'm not sure this is research so much as it's just pioneering collaboration models, but industry university partnerships, it's been an ongoing challenge area since World War II in the United States. We still haven't found super effective ways to transmit labor market signals to universities and get them to respond in real time. I think those would be a couple of areas that I would suggest are worthy of research or further rolling up our sleeves. Well, I guess I view research as a non-competitive way for us to collaborate and move the full dialogue forward. So I would say quality control and accreditation and collaboration between higher education as an institution and industry.
Okay, I see Gary has his hand up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think there's three of me on here. The main thing I see is that in order to the pedagogical worth of a particular badge is really important. At UCI, we have embedded badges in different courses, actually in the courses that we're offering. And anecdotally, we find that the students are much more engaged in their courses than when we don't offer badges. And I think if we could convince higher education folks that pedagogy was improved by putting badges into these courses, we could make significant inroads in the adoption of these micro-credentials and badges in higher education. And so I see a big need for the funding of a study on that particular topic.
Great research topic. Do badges increase engagement in students? That's a fascinating question. Thanks, Gary. Sean, what should...
so I'll chime in here, and thank you, Gary. I know Gary, and picking up on that point, we need more evidence. We need more on the outcomes and the benefits and the challenges. We need pilots. We need experiments. We need the foundational research. So I know this is just like a data point of one, but I tried to do an NSF proposal on this last year, and it was telling to me that the reviewers, they didn't have a sense of what micro-credentials are, what the demand for them is. There wasn't enough that I could necessarily cite in terms of scholarly journals that's been published on this. And so there's such a gap that I think we need to have kind of a broader understanding of what these approaches are, and that it is a big trend and necessary to study. But we need just about everything, I think, and it's going to be very exciting. But I'd especially emphasize the pilots and the experiments and sort of demonstration cases on both the college and university side, but also on the industry side and at the intersection. A lot of our work focuses on what's happening with employers and how do they hire and what does that mean for the education system. But everyone, all the parties in this ecosystem could, I think, benefit from more research. And something implicit in a lot of the comments and discussion, but I wanted to quickly call out as well, is the consumer and the learner, right? They don't have a guide. And certainly if we're experts in this kind of topic, back to the barbecue example, what's the person in the street know or need to know or think about these approaches? There's a lot more kind of customer education, if you will, to be done among both employers and learners. And I guess that's a responsibility on the educational institution side in part.
Thanks, Sean.
If I may tag on to that comment, I agree completely. I was talking to Todd Thibodeau, the CEO of CompTIA, at an event about 6 years ago. He was driving through Indonesia. He told me the story, driving through Indonesia, stopped to get gas, went inside to pay, and the guy behind the desk taking his money is studying for his A+ certification. Okay. And the thing is, as a lot of the major corporations realize, these certification examples and the desire to have access to these certifications and get credit for them is universal. It's anywhere you go. And people have mobile devices everywhere, and they have a desire. And I just love the thing about working with the community colleges, seeing the grit of these people who come from all parts of the world to California and want to learn. A lot of them, English is not easy for them. But everywhere you go, people want to learn. So the more we can do to make these digital certifications become a credit for prior learning or academically transferable for credit, to allow these people access to growth and get the recognition they deserve for the effort they're making, I think that's a good common project that we could tackle. That'd be advocacy for credit for prior learning based on digital badges.
Advocacy for, say that one more time, Steve. Sorry, I just didn't get it.
It'd be credit for prior learning is the term used in a lot of academic circles for really, but in digital badges, it's a little bit easier to see. And so we want to get credit for prior learning to embrace the standards that are set by these various credentials, and particularly see that it's applied in situations where people are, in less fortunate situations, and that will give them access to getting degrees and access to the workforce.
Love it. That's a great one. Thanks, Steve.
Can I make a quick comment on one as well?
Please.
So at IBM, we did a study, and this was not in any way formal in any way, and it certainly hasn't, it's only correlation, there's no causation here. We found that people that earned badges had 2 points higher engagement than those employees that didn't earn badges, which is obviously very dramatic. We also found that among what's called Band 8 at IBM, which is kind of a doer level of people at IBM, the people that earned badges with a statistically significant higher chance of staying with the company if they had earned at least one skill level badge than those that didn't. And then the third part was on sales, was on technical sellers who had earned certification badges were more likely to make their revenue targets than those that don't. So we found that there was this correlation between sales with attrition and engagement. And I would love to see somebody take this to the next level and do real validation studies on those areas.
Fantastic. Thanks. Those are really concrete and nice. Thanks, David. All right. Anyone else? Thanks, Yasi, for making sure we addressed Alex's questions.
Yeah, and I have another one, Jim, from Stephanie August, who was our program director at NSF for our previous NSF funding. So thanks, Stephanie. So this is a question to all speakers. What partnerships or activities have you found to be most effective in moving academia toward meeting industry employer needs for 21st century? For example, broadening education and tracking skills. And this is for all panelists.
So, Yasi, is the question, when two different types of entities collaborate, which types of those partnerships and collaborations tends to be most effective for, is that the question? Sorry, just asking for clarification.
And Stephanie, if you want to jump in, please do. I don't want to speak for you.
Yes, that's the question. We talk a lot about what the needs are. We talk about what industry needs. We talk about how academia works. But what we need to do is get academia, industry, the deans, the presidents, and everybody together in a room to think about what we really need to do. So what is an effective mechanism that you've seen for making that actually happen?
I would love to comment briefly, and that is that we tend to think from the corporate world that academic institutions operate top down, and they don't. And presidents and deans don't tell people what to teach. It's flipped. So really, you need to get access to the faculty, and there's a lot of faculty, and you have to figure out how to do that. So this really ends up being kind of more of a mass communications model. And you don't just get everybody in a room because there's too many people. And you have to convince each faculty individually.
At the same time, it's more effective if you can make the administration aware of what the needs are and get the faculty to ask for it, the administration to recognize that it's needed, and the students to say, yes, I want it. So it really takes a multi-pronged, collaborative approach.
If they're the logjam, I would agree. I haven't seen that very often, and typically they're seen as the enemy, and so it's an interesting, it's a big challenge. Obviously, that's why we're talking about it.
Yeah,
I've seen two models, and they actually may appear to be different ends of the spectrum that have some promise. So, the first, I'd say, caution universities to think about there being a silver bullet out there, because the most effective university industry collaborations I've seen are local and they're department level. A department advisory that engages the local employers and for all sorts of student interactions, clubs, competitions, internships, co-ops. Experiential learning can be a really effective way to engage this way. Sean can give examples, but Northeastern has been a leader on any number of fronts here in terms of building more successful partnerships with industry so that the university's programs are providing what industry needs. The second, and this is a more of a sort of a national level initiative, although it's led by the private sector, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been working on a model called talent pipeline management, which convenes groups of employers, has them talk about skills and skill gaps and skilling, and invites into that conversation
Oops, we may have lost Pete.
Did Pete cut out? Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add, really depends on the context and the incentives, right? An alignment of incentives. So certainly when there's direct funding involved, and I don't know that the jury's out, but it looks like some fascinating activity in the Washington, D.C. metro area and Virginia in terms of Amazon coming in with some big investments and everyone kind of getting together and saying, how are we going to build this workforce that we need, and countless other economic development examples like that. I think when colleges and when departments and faculty look around and they can see, okay, wow, we have a growing area of employment, and that's going to be here for some time because it's geographically based. They then invest in the programming, and their incentive in that is they're going to get student enrollment, and they're going to have an impact on the economy, which is part of their mission. But otherwise, the tenure of any given CEO or corporate leader, or even a college president, the year cycles that they move on, if you're really going to invest and create something new, it's quite a while before you have the graduates. And in this project we did over the summer, which was more focused on corporate training, we spoke with 40 executives across a number of industries all around the US. One of the things that we wanted to surface that was in our interview guide for every conversation was, examples of innovative partnerships in terms of working with colleges and universities around upskilling your workforce, right? They're incumbent workers. We got only a handful of interesting examples. They were good ones, but what we heard more about from the HR leaders, at least, was just thinking about the people they were hiring in, right? Not their workers, but what they get at the end of the pipeline in terms of what colleges and universities produce. And, you know, that's a very long cycle. That's creating a program, getting it approved, launching it, recruiting, the students go through it. What changes now with micro-credentials is there's a quicker cycle time. And so if colleges or outside providers or industry groups can mount and update and refresh a credential, maybe David could speak to that in terms of how quickly that can happen. You know, we can start skilling people up in a matter of weeks and months, and then they can come back to the table, and this can all start to move quickly in a world where, you know, there's all this change in skilling and what's required or needed out in the workforce.
Yeah, I'll also say that I think it's good to look at some specific examples from the demand side, right? Demand being the industry. So where are the gaps, skill gaps that we have that we need to really address jointly as an industry, whether it's the industry and the academic institutions coming together. And one great example is cybersecurity, right? In cybersecurity, we know there's a shortage of 2 million people in the world who are, needed in the industry. Now, the folks in the industry themselves cannot solve for this problem, right? You cannot train 2 million people to fill up these jobs. So you also need academic partnerships where you actually work with universities to see what existing curriculums and that you have out there you can use and build programs around it, so that when these graduates finish their coursework at the schools, then they can be connected to jobs within the industry. So I think picking some specific examples and problems from the demand side, whether it's cybersecurity, data sciences in the technology space, and I'm sure there's other examples in other areas, we can build actually a partnership between industry and academia and sort of pilot it and see how this model works. And then maybe from that, we can sort of build a scalable model. I think that's an interesting way to approach it, in my opinion.
Thanks, Roshan. I want to add just one other thing. Let me see if I can do this efficiently. To Stephanie's question about partnerships. Stephanie, I don't know if you can see the slide here or not, but both Sean Hinton and Guy Halftek have participated in ISSIP events over the years. Sean recently with the European Union and an event at the National Academy some years ago. But I do think that in addition to the perspective that you're hearing here, Stephanie, there is a lot of startup activity that I'm finding really, really worthwhile to track as well. So let me stop sharing my screen here. That might be another kind of partnership that's worth looking at, Stephanie, is some of the investment that's going in these areas. For example, I know SkyHive's working very closely with the European Union and Accenture. We had somebody from Accenture on just a little while ago. It looks like he's dropped. But that's another angle that's worth taking a look at, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Great. All right, let me look at the participants one more time. People should feel free to jump in. I see both John Ricketts has asked quite a few questions and Scott has asked quite a few questions. I think you've gotten some of your answers in the chat, but John, is there any burning question that you didn't get an answer to in the chat that you're curious to have the panelists' perspectives on? Maybe you can't come off mute.
I'm good, thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks for the questions, by the way. Really intriguing. And Scott, same. Thanks for all those questions. One of the questions you asked that I was curious about, you talked about interoperability, and I'm just wondering, Pete, could you summarize the interoperability that you're seeing? I think you did earlier, but I'm wondering if I could get you to do that again if your audio is working. I thought that summary was really good.
So I switched over to phone. Can you hear me?
Perfectly clear. Thanks, Pete. Yeah.
Awesome. Sorry for that earlier difficulty. College kids home from vacation, and you never know when you're going to get the bandwidth you need. Yeah, I mean, I think interoperability is as simple as standards compliance, right? You need to make sure that the platforms and the solutions you're using are standard compliant with whatever the prevailing standard is that you're making your bet with. There are multiple standards for credentials right now. The prevailing one is the open badge standard, but even IMS has something that overlaps and competes with that. You've got the W3C's verifiable credentials framework. You've got block certs in the blockchain arena. You've got a variety of proprietary blockchain formats. So the question is really, which of those standards have you evaluated and would you support and require in whatever solution you're either building or buying? And then from a learner perspective, it's around sovereignty. It's about the learner themselves owning and controlling access to their credentials. And that's all in keeping with the best practice globally now around privacy. So as an individual, I should be able to decide who can see my credentials under what conditions for how long. And if I ask that you remove access to my credentials, you comply with that. We're looking for more than that?
No, that was a great summary. And yeah, let's see if the panelists have any other questions for each other. I also see Gonzalo Salguero from Cisco on. He's on our ISSIP board. I don't know if you have any questions, Gonzalo, but I'm just going to start randomly calling on people. I've got a few. What? Go ahead.
I have a question for the panelists.
Please, Yatu.
So I want to hear your thoughts on, there's a lot of chatter saying that with micro-credentialing, the need for formal education and four-year degree program is going to go away. I want to know your thoughts, each of your thoughts on that. Another controversial question.
Well, okay, the idea of a 4-year degree program has two connotations. There's one connotation where you commit yourself to a full-time course of study for 4 years in a university. You don't do anything else, and that is it. And that's, at a very practical level, quite difficult for many people. And as a consequence, if that's the only mode by which you can get that 4 years worth of study, the 4 years worth of proof that you've dedicated yourself to a given area of study, then that version of a 4-year degree course quite obviously has limitations, and they're becoming increasingly apparent. If, on the other hand, you can go through a course of study where you accrete certifications and qualifications over time that add up to the same conceptual academic content, but you do it over a longer period, in a way that allows you to mix that with work, in a way that allows you to get professional certifications that count towards some form of the academic certification, then that concept is what we're trying to grow towards in this discussion. And that clearly has a lot of legs behind it, because there are many modes in which people can build up these certifications over time. We're not there yet, of course. We don't have that full interoperability, either technical or conceptual. But it's fairly clear that if we do have a mechanism where we can get rigorous, objective, testable certification at reasonable cost, if we have well-defined bodies of knowledge that we're able to test people on, and we have interoperability about how these certifications can be plugged together, there's another mode of getting there. It's still a 4-year degree in the sense that you're studying that volume of knowledge, but it's not the one where you have to dedicate yourself for 4 years without having an income while you're trying to raise a family, perhaps.
I was going to say, anybody who's been to a doctor's office recently knows that the nurse practitioner does more of the work than the doctor does these days, and they don't have a 4-year degree. They might have a certificate program. So I think it all depends on the job, right? But I think we need to take a hard look at it and start to, and I know, Steve, this is the hard part, right? Is that it might be pushed by employers that simply say, you know what, because of shortages, because of other circumstances, guess what? We're not going to require it. That's what happened in medicine. And I think that's what's going to happen in IT as well.
Well, it is happening in
There's a
IT.
lot.
I saw it the other day. A job advert, can't remember who it was, but they quite clearly said 4 years experience in lieu of a degree.
Well, I think I've talked to thousands of employers on this topic, and the 4-year degree is here to stay. It's not going away at all. Now, you may be more flexible now. You may be able to get in the door with less or whatever. But when it comes to promotions and running a group of people 10 years down the road, there's going to be a glass ceiling for anybody who doesn't have a 4-year degree. And so I think we need to be honest with ourselves. And yes, we can get them in the job with the skill sets, with the partials or whatever. But all these skill sets, ideally, and I heard it voiced earlier, need to flow into credit for a degree. Nobody should be asked to start over again once you're working and you've got all these skills. So I think we need to look at technical degrees. I think we need to look at something a little bit less than the traditional bachelor's in terms of the liberal arts, and maybe a little bit more of the technical side, because we have a lot of technical jobs these days. But it should include communications and managing other people and project management, skill sets like that. And it's a very important step. But if you tell people they don't need a degree and they get a job, 10 years later, they're going to be very upset with you.
Oh, we don't suggest that. We do need to get that body of knowledge that can be recognized as a degree. But you do have to, is it practical to expect everybody to dedicate 4 years of their life to do so in one block? If over 10 years you can do it, does that count?
Yeah, sure. That's fine. And really, they don't even care where you get it from. All I know is someone's got to be making a promotional decision, and they're going to be held accountable for the decision they make. And if they put somebody in a promoted capacity who doesn't have a degree and they fail, then it's on them. Mm-hmm. So it's organizational psychology more than anything else.
Yeah, it can be a both and I think we're seeing that today. There's virtually no data that suggests that degrees are, at risk in terms of demand. Look at the consumer demand, frankly, too. I mean, outside of community colleges, which have some special interests, some special issues in terms of why people enroll and non-credit and job training and everything else. The higher ed market's been pretty resilient. And yes, there are cases where micro-credentials can be great substitutes for degrees. There's working adults who are getting degrees over 10 years online today. But I think, and this is why the research interests me so much in terms of figuring out what is the reality, what is the demand, what are the outcomes, is I think there's been a lot of distraction in some of the headlines, and people can get misled and they can get confused. And when I say people, I mean the consumer, but also policymakers, employers, and educational leaders. When you see these headlines and you give them this emphasis, it's disruptive innovation. Higher ed is being disrupted. No one wants degrees anymore. Badges are taking over. Google doesn't like degrees. I mean, Google is hiring thousands of people per year with degrees, and a lot of people out of Stanford. In addition to offering, a great certificate program that may be able to help some people get ahead. And so it's a tricky issue, and it's hard to summarize it in the sort of polarized way that it tends to play out. And I think for the higher ed community, the research community, and industry, let's clarify some of this and figure out what the real opportunities are, because it is something that's happening, whether we like it or not. This stuff is coming and it's in demand.
So I'll give an it depends answer, right? And I'm reminded of this famous quote that I was at Cisco before Microsoft, and I'm reminded of this quote from our ex-CEO, John Chambers, who said, disrupt or get disrupted, right? So that's what we're talking about here. The model that we have today with university education and the 4-year degrees, it has to get completely disrupted, right? If it is not getting disrupted, if it's incremental changes that we are making, that 4-year degree is not going to survive. We have to be, just a quick example of what is needed, right? Like if a person gets a college degree and he or she is not job ready, there's absolutely no value in that degree, right? So we got to make sure we create a disruptive 4-year degree or whatever degree model that is making people ready for jobs and connecting them to the jobs that are in demand, right? I mean, that's what's needed, and incremental changes will not get us there. If we are making only incremental changes to the program, then it's not going to survive. that's my 2 cents.
Excellent.
I would add to that, and this is probably predictable given my perspective, but I think a core principle is that everyone should get credit for what they learn along the way. And David's talk around incremental credentialing has to be a core principle going forward. We need to stop asking people to start over. We need to stop asking them to pay more to do things they've already demonstrated. And provided we can do that, there are a lot of ways we can evolve degree requirements. Degrees can be more practical, they can be more job oriented, they can potentially be more theoretical if there's a market demand for that. But foundationally, my core belief is we got to stop asking people to start over, and we got to give them credit as they go.
Yeah.
So Pete, let me ask you this question, and maybe, Sean and the other panelists. So do you know of any employers who in their annual performance review, that dreaded, both managers dread it and the employees dread it, the annual performance review? Do you know of any employers where that annual performance review, the manager is able to say, and yes, you got these transferable credits as a result of the work that you did in my team this year? Have you heard of anybody doing that in the HR analytics space, Sean, Pete?
I'd say less often is that the case in an informal, like you completed the training that you're required to do your role. And more often it's the case when it's a work-based learning program like an apprenticeship. We are seeing this sort of thing with things that are structured to be that way, an apprenticeship or a co-op or an internship, where these are the requirements of the program and we're going to give you credentials as part of the outcomes from that program. But less in the kind of the common course of doing business. Now, David and IBM team, you've seen how IBM is doing this, and you're probably still out there at the bleeding edge because it matters at IBM whether or not you earn badges this year. You want to comment on that?
I mean, as far as, well, the other condition of employment in some cases, earning badges. But yeah, to stay relevant, obviously, I think that's the key there for us. Beyond that, I don't think there's any kind of, I don't know if there's any kind of real major incentive to get badges other than that there's this, basically it's kind of a social proof type of thing. We're not forced into it like some of these other, other people have talked about where it says, this is a condition of employment in most cases.
Now, the U.S. Armed Forces are actually an interesting exception because they're very formal about this stuff. Right now, they're not issuing transferable earner control credentials, but they absolutely have training requirements and they get reviewed on it. You do not advance if you don't complete those training requirements in a year. And they're increasingly thinking about how do we transfer this to you as you transition to the civilian sector. So when your service elapses and you want to go back into the private sector, how can we give you evidence of the training that you had at the Armed Forces, whether that's credit towards college or credit towards a role-based credential? The Teamsters Union, for instance, takes the training you get in the military and transitions you into Teamsters Union fast track apprenticeship driver program. Amazingly, if you get trained to drive heavy equipment in the U.S. Army, you can't come out and get your commercial driver's license immediately. You have to go back and retrain and requalify. It's crazy. Anyway.
That's a great point. Steph, I hope you heard that one about the military may be a partner, an important partner here. I think that was an excellent point you just brought up, Pete. That could really drive a lot of systemic change quickly.
Jim, I see Gary has his hand up. One of the Garys. I see 3 Garys, but one has his hands up. Gary?
Oh, I think he just left the room, so okay. I guess we didn't get to him quickly enough.
Never mind.
I will say that. So one thing I want to mention is I will say that we are getting very, very positive feedback from the market, from our customers. When we start to implement learning programs, assessment programs that are incremental testing, right? It's not like you have to do it all over again. We implemented that at Microsoft for recertifications. Traditional recertification programs is you have to go back and take the exam again, right? Like the exam that you took 2 years ago, your certification is expiring, go take the exam again. We changed it completely and we said, we're not going to ask you to go take the exam again. We are going to give you learning for the delta content. Since the last time you took the certification exam, well, whatever is the delta in terms of the product features, we will give it to you as micro learning modules. You can go take the learning at your own pace, whenever you want it, self-paced, and then you take a simple assessment on that delta, right? As long as we can assess you on the delta, we'll tell you that your skills are current with the latest technology updates. And we just launched it in March, and great feedback from the market, right? People love it. And we have a huge NPS, and everybody's coming back and recertifying now. And that's a great example of where, you know, you actually are not making people go back and do this thing all over again and repeating content, repeating assessment questions. That's not a value, right? When you make it incremental and you're only testing on delta and giving them learning, people are ready to do it. So I think that's what we are looking at Microsoft, right? How do we make everything stackable, incremental, so that people don't have to go repeat?
And that's a big hit with students, the small bites. And also the badge is a motivational thing that they accomplish and they share with their friends and things like that. So a lot of our students today can't sit around, wait 2 or 4 years to say, I got it. You know, they need little bits as they go. And that's a great way to provide it.
Yeah, that's a great point, Steve. I think millennials, especially if you look at millennials, right? They want, recognition along their journey, right? They don't want to be like waiting 4 years or 2 years, take an exam and then get a degree. They want, you want to gamify the experience and make sure at every point in their learning and certification or assessment journey, you can recognize them, give them you give them points, create a leaderboard, right? Those are the kind of things that we are trying to do at Microsoft Learn. It's a learning platform that we have been using for both certifications and learning, and that's helping us create that gamified experience, and learners love it, especially the millennials, to your point, Steve.
Very good, very good. Thank you. Well, we're coming to the end of our time, and I want to, just make sure anybody who's participating, if you need a little bit of space to ask the panelists questions, I want to create that space for you. So I'm just going to pause and see if anyone has a last burning question for our panelists. All right. I want to just really spend the last couple minutes thanking Pete and Sean and David and Sudarshan and Steve and Nathan and Yasi for carving out 3 hours out of your extremely busy schedule. You are, leaders in thinking about this, and I'm glad we had a chance, ISSIP NSF, to get the band back together, I think is what one of you said to me on one of the prep calls. So really delighted to have had this opportunity to learn from you all. You shared such important insights. I also do really want to shout out to our tremendous participants. John Ricketts and Scott McLeod, I saw you ask tons of questions. Others did as well. People introduced themselves. I really want to thank the participants for carving out the time as well to make this really a fantastic learning experience. And so thank you all very, very much. I know we could go on forever. Nobody asked the question, when will resumes go away? But I know that was lurking from a few people on the line, like Lou Freund, and I think we did uncover a lot of, if we were to do this again, it might be interesting to get someone, came up at the last little bit, someone with a military perspective. I think that would be really, really interesting. Maybe a few more startups or even a venture capital perspective might be another perspective on a future panel we could envision. But truly just thank all of you for just a tremendous day. And I think with that, we'll go ahead and give people 5 minutes back so you can get ready for your next thing in your busy lives. And thanks again. Any other last words from anyone before we say goodbye?
Jim, I want to thank you for being an excellent moderator, and my fellow panelists and all the participants. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting us. It's been a pleasure. Bye now, everybody.
I know.
Here.